Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Settle in and let the evening close its doors around you, because tonight we are walking somewhere very old, very hushed, and very kind. Tonight we visit the infirmary of a medieval monastery, the quiet wing set apart from the rest of the cloister, where the sick were tended, the aged were cared for, and the dying were allowed to leave this world gently, by candlelight, with someone holding their hand. We will wander its rooms one by one. We will step out through the low door into the Physic garden beyond the cloister wall, where the herbs grew in their long straight beds. We will watch remedies made the slow way, by hand, by patience, the only way anyone knew how to make them then. We will learn about bloodletting and about the strange and careful calendar the monks kept for it, a calendar tied to the moon and to the turning of the seasons. We will sit for a while in the warming room, the one chamber in the whole monastery where a fire was allowed to burn through the cold months, and we will understand why that single fire mattered so much. And we will end, as we always try to end here, with the old manuscripts, the herbals and the leechbooks, the quiet books of remedies that a few careful hands kept alive for centuries, so that none of this knowledge would be lost. There is no rush tonight. There is no argument to win and no mystery to solve before you can rest. There is only a long, slow, gentle walk through a place that valued rest and healing above almost everything else. If your eyes grow heavy before we are finished, that is exactly as it should be. Let them close whenever they are ready. I will still be here, speaking softly into the dark, for as long as you need me. Before we step through the infirmary door, it helps to understand what this place actually was, because it was not a hospital in the way we would recognize one today, and it was not simply a sick room either. In most large monasteries, the infirmary was its own small world within the larger world of the abbey. It had its own hall, its own kitchen in some cases, its own garden, its own chapel, or at least its own altar, and its own rhythm of life that ran gently out of step with the rest of the community. The monks who lived under the ordinary discipline of the abbey rose in the dark for the night office, fasted through long stretches of the church calendar, and kept a rule of silence that shaped almost every hour of the day. The infirmary softened all of that. Meat forbidden to the healthy monks under most monastic rules was permitted to the sick and the aged, because the body needed strength to heal, and the rule was never meant to starve a weak man back to health. The night office could be shortened or skipped for those too ill to rise. The silence could be broken, quietly, for a word of comfort. In those days, illness was not treated as a failure of will or a matter of shame, at least not inside these walls. It was treated as a condition to be managed with patience, herbs, warmth, food, and company, in roughly that order of importance, and the person appointed to manage it all was a monk known as the Infirmarer. The Infirmarer held one of the busiest and most trusted offices in the entire monastery, and yet his name rarely appears in the grand chronicles the way an abbot's or a bishop's might. He is, in the surviving records, most often simply the Infirmarer, a title rather than a person, which somehow suits the quiet, unglamorous nature of the work itself. He was chosen according to the customaries that governed daily life in houses across Europe, for qualities that had almost nothing to do with ambition. He needed patience above all else, because the sick complain, and the aged repeat themselves, and the dying sometimes rage against a fate no one can change, and a man without patience would not have lasted a season in that role. He needed a steady hand, because he was expected to prepare medicines himself, to change dressings, to bleed a vein with a lancet when the calendar called for it, and none of that forgives clumsiness. He needed a good memory, because so much of the medical knowledge of the age lived not in a single book, but in the accumulated experience of the herb garden, passed from one infirmarer to the next like a long, quiet inheritance. And he needed, more than anything, a kind of settled temperament, because the infirmary was the one place in the monastery where the strict hierarchy of the cloister softened into something closer to a family, and a harsh or impatient infirmarer would have made that impossible. He was rarely alone in the work for long. Most infirmaries of any real size kept at least one assistant, often a younger monk or a novice, showing an early aptitude for the quiet. Careful attention the role demanded, assigned to help with the heavier physical tasks, carrying water, tending the fire, changing soiled linen, while gradually absorbing, through years of close observation, the slower and more delicate knowledge that could not simply be handed over in a single afternoon. This was, in effect, the medieval version of an apprenticeship, unhurried and thorough, and it explains a great deal about why the office of infirmarer so often passed across the surviving records of individual houses, from one generation of monks to the next, in an almost unbroken chain, each infirmarer training his own eventual successor across years of shared daily labor at the same herb beds and the same still room bench. In those days, nothing about this training was written down as a formal course of study. It lived entirely in the doing, in the watching, in the slow correction of a young hand that had measured a dose slightly wrong or gathered a root a season too early. And it was passed on with exactly the same patience the infirmarer brought to every other part of his work. The work itself began before dawn and rarely ended before the last candle was blown out. The infirmarer walked the ward each morning, checking each patient in turn, adjusting blankets, refilling water, noting who had slept and who had not. He consulted the Physic garden almost daily, because fresh herbs lost their potency quickly, and a good infirmarer planned his harvesting the way a cook plans a meal, a little at a time, close to when it was needed. He kept a mental ledger, and sometimes a written one, of who needed what an infusion of chamomile for one brother's restless stomach, a poultice of comfrey for another's bruised hip, a warm cordial of aniseed, and honey for the old monk whose cough had settled into his chest for the winter. He answered to the abbot in matters of the rule, but in matters of medicine, within these walls, his word was close to final. Even visiting physicians, on the rare occasions one was summoned from outside, were expected to work alongside him rather than around him, because he alone knew the particular needs of each man under his care, sometimes stretching back years. What makes this arrangement so fascinating, when you sit with it for a while, is how thoroughly practical it all was, wrapped in a language of devotion. The monks did not separate the care of the body from the care of the soul the way we tend to now. Christ himself was described in their own texts as the true physician, and the infirmarer's daily labor was understood as a form of prayer carried out with the hands rather than the lips. This meant the infirmary was never treated as a lesser or purely functional space. It was swept, aired, and kept as clean as anyone in that century knew how to keep a room. It often had its own small altar or window facing the church, so that even a bedridden brother could hear the bells and follow the hours of prayer from where he lay. The truth is, this quiet fusion of medicine and devotion produced something we would now call holistic care almost by accident, simply because no one thought to draw the line separating the two. And so, tonight, we begin where the Infirmarer himself would have begun most mornings, not at the bedside, but at the low wooden door in the cloister wall that led out to the garden. The Physic garden of a medieval monastery rarely announced itself. It sat, more often than not, tucked against a south-facing wall, sheltered from the worst of the wind, close enough to the infirmary that a monk could carry a freshly cut bundle of herbs across the yard before the morning dew had burned off. The great monastic plan drawn up at St. Gall in the 9th century, one of the very few such plans to survive from the period, shows this arrangement with remarkable clarity. 16 long, narrow beds are marked out beside the physician's house, each one labelled with the name of a single plant, laid out in careful rows like a page from a manuscript come to life. Rose and lily for their sweetness and their symbolic purity, fenugreek and iris for the treatment of coughs and internal complaints, sage, called by the old herbalists the herb that makes a man immortal, or at least the herb that helps him live a little longer, rue, cumin, fennel, pennyroyal, mint, all named in their own beds, all grown for a purpose rather than for beauty, though beauty seems to have arrived there anyway, almost as a side effect of care. It is worth pausing, too, on the sheer sensory richness this garden must have offered, quite apart from its careful medicinal purpose, because the surviving herbals, focused as they generally are on practical use, rarely linger on this side of things, and it would be a small injustice to walk past it too quickly ourselves tonight. Imagine the layered scent of such a place on a warm morning after rain. Lavender's clean, sharp sweetness, rosemary's resinous depth, the softer, rounder fragrance of chamomile flowers just opening, mint's cool brightness threading through all of it whenever a passing hand brushed a leaf in walking by. Bees moved steadily between the flowering rows, their low, contented hum a near constant undertone to the garden's own particular quiet. Butterflies, drawn to the same nectar the bees sought, drifted between the beds in a way the monks themselves noted, here and there, in the margins of their own writing, small observations of natural beauty folded in almost as an aside to the more practical business of medicine, as though the two were never really separate concerns at all. This garden was not the same as the larger kitchen garden that fed the whole community, though the two sometimes overlapped in their plantings. The Physic garden, sometimes called the Herbularius, was smaller, more deliberate, and tended with a different kind of attention. A monk assigned to this work, sometimes the Infirmarer himself, and sometimes a brother working directly under him, moved through the rows in the early morning, before the heat of the day could draw the volatile oils out of the leaves and weaken their strength. Imagine for a moment the stillness of that hour, the cloister quiet after the office of prime, the dew-still silver on the sage and the lavender, a single monk kneeling between the beds with a small knife, working in a silence that was not empty but full of attention, full of a kind of reverence for the plants themselves. The garden followed its own calendar, distinct from but woven into the great cycle of feast days and fasts that shaped the monastic year. Certain herbs were gathered in the full flush of early summer, when their oils were said to be at their strongest. Others were left until after their flowers had gone to seed, because it was the root the monks wanted, and a root gathered too early gave up little of its power. Comfrey, prized for knitting wounds and easing the pain of a bruised limb, was often dug in autumn, when the plant had drawn its strength back down into the ground for the winter. Elder, whose flowers made a gentle remedy for fevers and whose berries were cooked into a syrup for coughs, gave 2 separate harvests from the same tree in a single season, one in early summer and one in early autumn, a small and steady gift repeated year after year. The paths between the beds mattered almost as much as the beds themselves, laid out with a deliberate geometry that made the whole garden easy to walk, easy to tend, and easy to read at a glance. Each bed's edge kept clear and distinct, so that a tired or distracted brother could never mistake one row of careful medicine for another. Some houses edged their beds with low-clipped hedges of box or lavender, both practical, since a neat border discouraged the spread of weeds from the paths into the growing beds themselves, and quietly beautiful, the kind of ordinary, unremarked beauty that seems to have simply accompanied good, careful practical work in this period without anyone needing to comment on it directly. A stone bench, where the garden's size and the house's means allowed for one, offered a place to sit a while between tasks, or for an aging brother no longer strong enough for the harder digging and weeding, to rest in the sun and watch the younger hands at work, still present, still useful in his quiet way, still part of the garden's long, unbroken rhythm, even as his own part in its labor slowly lessened. Beyond the beds of the Physic garden proper, many monasteries kept a slightly wilder strip of ground where less cultivated plants were allowed to grow with a looser hand. Nettle, despite its sting, was harvested here for its usefulness in spring tonics and in strengthening broths given to the weak. Plantain, the humble broadleaf weed that grows along almost any path in almost any country, was so widely used for insect stings, small cuts, and skin irritations that some infirmaries kept it close to hand rather than sending a novice out to search the fields for it. In those days, nothing that grew was dismissed too quickly. A plant considered a nuisance in the vegetable rows might be exactly the remedy needed in the infirmary that same afternoon, and the infirmarer's knowledge extended quietly to both. It is worth pausing here on something the surviving garden plans and herbals make clear, though it rarely gets said outright. The Physic garden was never meant to be self-sufficient in the way a modern person might imagine. Monasteries traded seeds, cuttings, and even finished remedies between houses, sometimes across considerable distances. A monastery in a cold northern valley might receive rosemary cuttings from a sister house further south, where the winters allowed the plant to survive more easily. Saffron, too costly and too particular in its growing needs for most houses to cultivate themselves, arrived instead as a traded good, prized for its use in treating melancholy and settling the stomach, and handled with the same careful attention a treasurer might give to coin. The garden, then, was not an isolated patch of ground behind a single wall. It was one small node in a slow, patient network of monasteries sharing what each had learned, plant by plant, letter by letter, across the long medieval centuries. Bees, too, belonged to this garden's quiet economy in a way that touched almost everything else the infirmary produced. A row of simple straw skeps, or later, in the wealthier houses, more permanent wooden hives, sat at the garden's edge, tended by a brother whose steady, careful temperament suited this particular work as well as it suited the mortar and the herb beds themselves. Honey, gathered once or twice a year, depending on the region and the season, sweetened the syrups and electuaries of the still room, softened the harshness of a bitter decoction, and preserved fruit and other perishable goods through the long months when nothing fresh could be had. Beeswax, the second great gift of the hive, became candles for the infirmary hall and the scriptorium alike, and occasionally the base for a firmer, longer-lasting salve when animal fat alone would not hold its shape. The bees themselves, industrious and orderly in a way medieval writers found genuinely admirable, were sometimes held up in the sermons and moral writings of the period as a kind of small, natural model for the disciplined, purposeful life of the monastery itself, each bee doing its own small, patient part for the good of the whole hive, not unlike a single brother doing his own small, patient part for the good of the whole community. Let us walk now along the beds themselves for a while, because there is a particular pleasure in simply naming what grew there, the way the infirmarer himself might have named them under his breath while working. Sage, for the throat and for calming an unsettled mind. Hyssop, sharp and aromatic, used for coughs and for cleansing wounds. Rue, bitter and strong-smelling, treated with respect for its potency and used sparingly. Lavender, gentle and sweet, prized even then for easing a restless head into sleep, its dried flowers sometimes tucked into a small linen pillow for exactly that purpose. Fennel, valued for settling the stomach after a heavy meal, its seeds chewed plain or steeped into a warm tea. Mint, cooling and clean, grown almost everywhere because it grew so willingly and asked so little in return. Parsley and chervil, mild herbs used as much in the kitchen as in the sick room, blurring, as so many plants did, the line between food and medicine. Vervain, associated in the old herbals with protection and with easing anxious thoughts. Betony, considered by some medieval writers to be almost a cure-all, recommended for headaches, for wounds, for troubled sleep, for nearly anything that ailed a body or unsettled a mind. Wormwood, bitter beyond almost anything else in the garden, used carefully and in small amounts to expel intestinal worms and to strengthen a weak digestion. Agrimony, gentle and astringent, brewed into a tea for sore throats and for healing wounds from the inside out, so to speak, by strengthening the blood. Each of these plants carried, in the mind of a medieval herbalist, a kind of character, almost a personality, built from centuries of observation passed down through both written texts and spoken tradition. The classical authors, Dioscorides most of all, whose Herbal from the 1st century still circulated in Latin translation through monastic libraries 1,000 years later, gave the framework. Each plant was understood to have a particular quality, hot or cold, wet or dry, and illness was understood, broadly, as an imbalance among these same qualities within the body. A fever, hot and dry in its nature, called for herbs considered cooling and moistening. A chill, cold and wet, called for the opposite. This system, inherited from Greek medicine and filtered through centuries of Latin commentary, gave the infirmarer a kind of logic to work from, even when, by our own modern understanding. The underlying theory has long since been set aside. What remains striking, even now, is how much careful, patient observation sits underneath that old framework. The herbs that eased a fever often did contain compounds that genuinely reduced inflammation. The plants recommended for wound healing often did have real antiseptic properties. The old system was not simply superstition dressed up as medicine. It was centuries of trial, error, and careful record-keeping, wrapped in a theoretical language that has since fallen out of use, the way an old map might use place names that have since changed, while the roads themselves remain essentially the same. The garden also had its quieter, more private uses, ones that rarely make it into the formal herbals, but that surface occasionally in the margins of monastic records. Roses, grown as much for the church as for the infirmary, provided petals for rosewater, used to soothe tired eyes and to freshen a sick room that had, inevitably, seen its share of difficult hours. Lilies, similarly dual purpose, decorated the altar on feast days and provided oil, infused slowly over weeks, for softening dry skin and easing the stiffness of aching joints in the elderly brothers. The line between devotion and medicine, again, simply was not drawn the way we would draw it now. A rose grown to honor the Virgin, and a rose grown to soothe a fevered brow were, in the Physic garden of a medieval monastery, very often the exact same rose, cut from the exact same bush, by the exact same patient hand. The garden carried, too, a layer of meaning that went well beyond its practical, medicinal purpose, one worth pausing on for a moment before we move any further. The enclosed garden, walled and entered through a single narrow gate, echoed a very old image in the Christian imagination, the hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden of Scripture, understood as a symbol of purity, protection, and a kind of restored paradise set apart from the disorder of the wider fallen world. A monk working quietly among the sage and the lavender in the cool of early morning was not, in the understanding of his own age, engaged in a purely practical task set apart from his spiritual life. He was, in a very real sense, within the framework these communities lived by, tending a small living echo of Eden itself, and the plain, patient labor of weeding and watering carried within it, at least potentially, exactly the same devotional weight as an hour spent at prayer in the church nearby. This blending of the practical and the sacred, which we have already touched on once or twice tonight, runs so consistently through every part of the infirmary's work that it is worth naming clearly here. At the very source of the whole system, in the garden itself, where the physical labor of growing medicine and the spiritual labor of tending a symbolic paradise were, quite simply, understood as the very same unbroken act. The tools of this work were simple and few: a small hand trowel, a light hoe for turning the soil between the beds, a watering can or a simple leather bucket carried from the nearest well or cistern, and a knife or small pair of shears for the careful, deliberate work of harvesting, weeding, watering, and the turning of the soil between plantings filled a great many quiet hours across the growing season, work that fell, depending on the size of the house, either to the infirmarer himself in his quieter moments, or to a novice specifically assigned to assist him. Learning the garden's rhythms the same slow way, he would eventually learn everything else the role required. Rain, drought, an unexpected late frost, or a particularly hard winter could threaten a whole season's careful planning in a single night, and the surviving account rolls of several houses record, here and there, a bad year for the garden noted with the same quiet, resigned acceptance given to any other of the season's unpredictable hardships, followed always by the same patient work of replanting, and beginning again the following spring. By the time the sun had fully cleared the cloister roof, the morning's harvest was usually done, and the infirmarer or his assistant carried the day's gathering back across the yard in a wide, shallow basket, the cut stems still damp, the leaves still fragrant, ready for the next stage of a process that had been repeated, in one form or another, for as long as anyone in that community could remember. And it is to that next stage, the slow transformation of a garden's harvest into something a sick or aging body could actually use, that we will turn shortly. But first, let us step inside the infirmary hall itself, because it deserves its own quiet attention before we go any further. The infirmary hall was, in most monasteries, large enough to have a long room, often built somewhat apart from the main cloister buildings, sometimes with its own small courtyard or garden attached directly to it, sometimes connected to the church by a short covered walkway, so the sick could be carried to Mass without exposure to the weather. Unlike the dormitory, where the healthy monks slept in a single long row of narrow beds under a strict and largely unbroken silence, the infirmary hall allowed for a gentler arrangement. Beds were sometimes partitioned, at least partially, with wooden screens or hanging curtains, offering a small measure of privacy that the ordinary dormitory did not provide. A hearth, where the layout allowed for one, kept the room warmer than the rest of the monastery, because cold was understood correctly to slow healing and to be particularly dangerous for the aged and the very ill. Light came through whatever windows the building possessed, often deliberately placed to catch the morning sun, both for its warmth and, we might guess, for the simple comfort of watching daylight move slowly across a wall when there was little else to do but wait and heal. Candles and oil lamps carried the room through the darker hours, their flames tended carefully, since fire in a building full of straw bedding and dry rushes on the floor was a genuine and constant danger, one the infirmarer would have guarded against as closely as he guarded against any illness. The floor itself was usually strewn with fresh rushes or straw, changed regularly, sometimes mixed with fragrant herbs like meadowsweet or lavender, both to freshen the air of a room that inevitably held the smells of sickness, and because a pleasant scent was itself considered, in the medical thinking of the age, to have a genuine calming and even healing effect on a troubled body. Beds in the infirmary were, by the standards of the wider monastery, comparatively soft. Where the ordinary dormitory bed might be a simple straw pallet on a wooden frame, the infirmary bed was more likely to include a proper mattress, sometimes stuffed with wool rather than straw, extra blankets, and a pillow. Small comforts that the healthy monk was expected to do without under the ordinary discipline of the rule, but that were freely given here, without hesitation or judgment. This detail matters more than it might first appear. It tells us something quiet but important about how these communities understood the purpose of the infirmary. It was not a place of punishment or even simply of confinement. It was a place explicitly built and furnished for comfort, on the understanding that comfort itself was part of the cure. Water, too, played a larger role in the infirmary's daily life than a modern visitor might expect. Many of the larger monasteries, Cluny among the most celebrated examples, developed genuinely sophisticated systems of pipes and channels bringing clean, running water from a distant spring or well directly into the heart of the monastic complex, serving the kitchen, the lavabo where the brothers washed before meals, and, in the better provisioned houses, the infirmary itself. This mattered enormously for a sick or aging body, since clean water for drinking, for washing wounds, and for the general cleanliness of the ward was, even without any formal understanding of why, plainly and reliably better for recovery than the fouled or stagnant water that so much of the wider medieval population had little choice but to rely upon. The infirmarer, in houses fortunate enough to have this kind of engineering, benefited directly from a piece of civil infrastructure that would not have felt entirely out of place in its basic underlying logic several centuries later. A small chapel, or at least a dedicated altar, usually stood at one end of the hall, allowing Mass to be said within sight and hearing of every bed, and allowing the sacraments to be brought easily to a brother too weak to be moved. This proximity meant that the rhythm of prayer, the same rhythm that structured every hour of monastic life beyond these walls, continued inside the infirmary too, softened but never entirely set aside. A bedridden monk could still hear the bell for vespers, could still, in his own quiet way, follow along with the office as the sound drifted in through the open door or the thin partition wall, and there is something genuinely moving in imagining that continuity, that sense of remaining part of the community's daily rhythm, even from a sick bed, even in the last months or weeks of a long life. The infirmary kitchen, where one existed as a separate space from the main monastic kitchen, prepared food according to the special dispensations already mentioned: meat broths for the weak, softer bread for those with poor teeth or troubled digestion, warmed wine or oil mixed with honey, and spices for those who needed building up. This was not luxury in any excessive sense, but it was, by the austere standards of monastic life generally, a marked and deliberate gentleness, offered specifically to those whose bodies could no longer bear the ordinary rule, and offered, it seems clear from the surviving records, without any suggestion that accepting this gentleness was itself a kind of failure. Illness excused a man from fasting the way almost nothing else could, and no one thought less of him for it. We have spent this first stretch of the evening simply arriving, walking the garden, stepping into the hall, meeting, in a general sense, the man whose daily labor held this whole quiet world together. There is a great deal more still ahead of us tonight. The slow work of turning a basket of cut herbs into an actual remedy, the particular rhythm of the bloodletting calendar, the warming room and its single fire, the long patient care given to the aged and the dying, and finally the old herbals and leechbooks that carried all of this knowledge forward through centuries that were, in so many other ways, difficult and uncertain. But there is no need to rush toward any of it. Let your shoulders settle a little further into whatever surface is holding you right now. Let your breathing slow, just slightly, to match the unhurried pace of the words themselves. We have all night, and the infirmary, in its own quiet way, has waited patiently for nearly 1,000 years. It can wait a little longer while you drift, and I will simply keep speaking, gently, into the dark. Let us turn now to what happened after the harvest, because a cut stem of sage or a handful of chamomile flowers was only the very beginning of the process, not the end of it. Long before a remedy could be given to a suffering brother, it had to be prepared, and preparation in a medieval infirmary meant drying, and drying meant the loft. Most infirmaries with any serious herb garden attached to them kept a drying loft somewhere close by, often a low attic space above the infirmary kitchen, or a dedicated small building with slatted walls that let air move freely while keeping out the worst of the rain and the direct sun. The logic behind this was entirely sound, even if the monks who followed it could not have explained it in the terms a chemist would use today. Direct sunlight breaks down many of the delicate compounds that give herbs their medicinal strength, so the drying loft was built and used specifically to avoid it, favoring instead a slow, shaded, well-ventilated darkness that preserved as much of a plant's original character as possible. Bundles of lavender, sage, thyme, and rosemary hung upside down from the roof beams in long rows, tied at the stem with twine or thin strips of willow bark, filling the low space with a scent that must have been almost overwhelming to a novice sent up there for the first time on an errand. The timing of this work mattered enormously, and a good infirmarer, or the brother trusted with this particular task, learned it slowly, over years, the way any craft is learned. Herbs cut too early, before their oils had fully developed, dried into pale, weak versions of themselves, offering little real strength when finally used. Herbs cut too late, after flowering had exhausted the plant's stored energy, dried into something dusty and spent. The window for a good harvest was often surprisingly narrow, sometimes no more than a week or two in a given season, and this is part of why the infirmarer's garden work could not simply be handed to any willing pair of hands. It required an accumulated, almost intuitive sense of timing that came only from years of close attention, season after season, watching the same beds through their same slow cycles. Once dried, the herbs were rarely left loose. Most were stripped from their stems, crumbled gently between the fingers, and stored in small linen bags or, in the wealthier houses, in glazed pottery jars, each one carefully labeled, since a mistaken herb could do real harm rather than good. Wormwood, gentle as it sounds in a modern ear, was strong enough that an infirmarer had to measure it with real care, and a jar mistaken for something milder could genuinely sicken the person it was meant to help. The labeling itself, often in Latin abbreviations that only the literate members of the community could read easily, reflects how seriously this work was taken. This was not casual kitchen herb storage. It was closer, in spirit if not in scale, to what we would now recognize as a small working pharmacy, organized, catalogued, and guarded against error. Flowers, seeds, and leaves each demanded their own, slightly different handling once the drying itself was complete, a further layer of care that a novice learned only gradually, through repeated small corrections from the infirmarer's own experienced eye. Flowers, delicate and quick to lose their color and their scent, were generally the first to be used from a given year's harvest, since their potency faded soonest of all the plant materials the still room kept in store. Seeds, by contrast, kept remarkably well when properly dried, fennel and dill and caraway among them, sometimes remaining genuinely useful for several years if stored away from damp and direct light. A small, quiet mercy for an infirmary managing an uncertain harvest from one season to the next. Leaves generally fell somewhere between the two in how quickly they lost their strength, and a careful infirmary learned, through long practice, roughly how many months he could trust a given leaf before its usefulness had faded past the point of being worth using at all. Roots presented their own separate challenge, since they could not simply be hung and left to the air the way leaves and flowers could. Comfrey root, valerian root, and the roots of various other plants, prized for their medicinal strength, were typically washed carefully to remove soil, sliced into thin rounds to speed the drying process and prevent rot from taking hold in the thicker, damper core, and then spread on woven trays or clean cloth in a similarly shaded, airy space. Valerian in particular carries a strong, somewhat pungent smell once dried, one that surviving accounts suggest monks grew rather fond of over time, associating it, as we might associate the smell of a particular tea or tincture today, with the promise of an easier night's sleep for whichever brother needed it. In reality, valerian's calming effect on a restless mind is one of the better documented pieces of medieval herbal knowledge that has carried forward largely intact into our own time, still used today in gentle sleep remedies, not so different in principle from the ones prepared in that quiet, drying loft 900 years ago. Measurement, too, was treated with a seriousness that might surprise anyone who imagines medieval medicine as a matter of rough guesswork. The infirmary worked with a small set of weights and simple balance scales kept specifically for this purpose, following units inherited from the apothecary tradition of the wider medieval world. The drachm, the scruple, the grain, each one a small, carefully defined fraction of the pound, allowing a dose to be measured with real consistency from one preparation to the next, rather than left to a rough handful judged by eye. This mattered most of all with the stronger, more potentially dangerous substances the cupboard held, and a careful infirmary trained his assistant in the correct use of these weights early, long before he trusted the younger monk with the still room's more delicate work unsupervised, because a fraction too much of the wrong substance could turn a helpful remedy into a genuinely harmful one. Once the year's harvest had been gathered and dried and safely stored, the infirmary's real work, the daily transformation of stored ingredients into something a sick body could actually use, took place in what many houses called the still room, though the term covered a wider range of activity than the word might suggest to a modern ear. This was, essentially, the working heart of the whole medical operation, a room set aside for the patient, repetitive labor of turning dried plants and simple ingredients into infusions, decoctions, tinctures, syrups, and ointments. The small handful of forms that almost every medieval remedy eventually took. An infusion was, and still is, the simplest of these preparations, dried or fresh herb material steeped in hot water, much the way a modern cup of tea is made, drawing out the water-soluble compounds in a matter of minutes. Chamomile flowers, mint leaves, and lime blossom were most often prepared this way, gentle remedies for an unsettled stomach or a restless mind, quick to make and quick to act. A decoction went a step further and asked more patience of the person making it. Where an infusion simply steeped, a decoction simmered, sometimes for a considerable stretch of time, and was used for tougher plant material, bark, roots, and woody stems. that would not readily give up their properties to a brief steeping alone. Willow bark, valued for easing pain and reducing fever long before anyone understood exactly why it worked, was almost always prepared as a decoction, boiled gently over a low fire until the water itself had taken on the bark's bitter character. Tinctures required something the still room did not always have in abundant supply: strong alcohol, usually wine or a distilled spirit, where the monastery had the means to produce or acquire one. Herb material was steeped, sometimes for weeks, in this alcohol base, drawing out compounds that water alone could not easily extract, producing a concentrated remedy that kept far longer than a simple infusion and could be dispensed in small, carefully measured drops rather than a full cup at a time. Some of the wealthier or more sophisticated monastic houses, particularly those with strong connections to the medical schools of southern Europe, developed genuine skill in this kind of preparation, and a handful of monastic tincture recipes survive in manuscript form even now, their instructions still perfectly legible, still, in principle, perfectly usable. Syrups solved a different problem entirely: how to make a genuinely bitter or unpleasant remedy tolerable enough that a sick or elderly brother would actually take the full dose rather than half of it. Honey, produced in the monastery's own beehives in most well-established houses, served as both preservative and sweetener, and a syrup of elderberry or horehound, or one of the many cough remedies of the age, owed as much to a practical understanding of human reluctance as it did to any particular medical theory. It did the sick person no good at all to prepare a perfectly correct remedy that the patient simply refused to swallow, and the infirmarer, whatever else he was also a practical man who understood his patients as people, not merely as cases to be treated according to a text. Ointments and salves, the last of the major categories, were built on a base of animal fat, most often lard or tallow, sometimes beeswax where a firmer texture was wanted, into which herb material had been slowly infused over gentle heat, drawing the plant's oils into the fat itself. Comfrey ointment, used for bruises, sprains, and slow-healing wounds, was among the most common of these preparations across the surviving record. Its reputation for knitting damaged tissue together so strong that the plant earned itself the folk name knitbone in several regions, a name that has, remarkably, survived into the present day. Calendula, the bright orange marigold grown almost everywhere for its cheerful color as much as its medicinal use, went into similar preparations for minor skin complaints, its gentle antiseptic and soothing properties genuinely useful for exactly the kinds of small daily injuries: a burn from the kitchen fire, a scrape from garden work, that any working community was bound to accumulate. The still room's fire itself deserved careful tending in its own right, distinct even from the general household fires kept elsewhere in the monastery. A decoction simmered too vigorously could scorch and spoil, its careful balance of extracted compounds lost to an overeager flame, and an ointment's base fat, heated too quickly or too high, could separate or burn rather than gently absorbing the herb's oils the way a slow, patient heat allowed it to. This meant the brother tending the still room's fire needed almost as practiced a sense of timing and temperature as the infirmarer himself brought to his diagnostic work. Another small, largely invisible skill folded quietly into the daily rhythm of a room whose real, patient craft so rarely announced itself with any particular fanfare. A further category of remedy, the electuary, sat somewhere between a syrup and a medicine proper, a thick paste of powdered herb bound together with honey, or a reduced sugar syrup where the costly imported sweetener could be had, taken by the spoonful rather than drunk. Electuaries suited remedies meant to be taken steadily over many days, a general strengthening formula for a brother recovering slowly from a long illness, or a gentle daily preparation for the aged. Since a spoonful of a sweet, thick paste was easy to measure consistently and easy to keep on hand without spoiling the way a fresh infusion, prepared new each day, would have been. Cordials, similarly, warmed and spiced wine or ale infused with strengthening herbs, ginger, cinnamon where it could be traded for, or the milder garden herbs already familiar to us, served much the same steady, restorative purpose offered to a weak or recovering brother, a little at a time across the course of a day, rather than all at once. The still room itself, in the layout of a well-organized infirmary, usually stood close to both the herb store and the kitchen, since fire was needed for the decoctions and the ointment bases, and proximity mattered a great deal in an age before anything could simply be carried quickly from one part of a large complex to another. A small hearth, a set of pottery or metal vessels kept specifically for medical use rather than cooking, a stone or wooden mortar and pestle for grinding dried material into powder, and shelves of the finished preparations, arranged and labeled with the same careful attention given to the drying loft above, made up the essential furniture of the room. It was, by any reasonable measure, a genuine working laboratory, centuries before that particular word would come into common use, staffed by a single patient man who had learned his craft the slow way, through years of quiet repetition, one infusion, one decoction, one careful measurement at a time. From the still room, finished remedies moved to their final resting place before use the apothecary's cupboard, sometimes a single large piece of furniture with many small drawers and compartments, sometimes an entire small room lined with shelves, depending on the size and wealth of the house. This was the visible face of the infirmarer's work, the place where a visiting physician, an anxious novice, or the abbot himself, checking in on the well-being of his community, would see at a glance the full scope of what the infirmary kept in store. Rows of small labeled jars held dried herbs not yet made into a finished remedy. Stoppered glass or pottery vessels, where glass was available and affordable, held tinctures and cordials, their contents visible through the material in a way that made checking a stock at a glance much easier than opening every single container. Wooden boxes, sometimes divided into small compartments, held more costly or more delicate ingredients, saffron threads, small quantities of imported spices, used as much for medicine as for flavor in that period, perhaps a little precious frankincense or myrrh, valued not only for their scent in church use, but for genuine antiseptic properties recognized, again, more through long observation than through any formal chemical understanding. The cupboard was typically kept locked, or at least closely watched, not out of any excessive secrecy, but out of simple practicality. Some of what it held, wormwood in quantity, certain strong purgatives, occasionally a small store of poppy preparation, used very sparingly for the most severe pain, could genuinely harm a person if taken carelessly or without proper measurement, and the infirmarer, as the one person in the community who fully understood both the uses and the dangers of what he kept, guarded access accordingly. This was not distrust of his brothers so much as a working professional's ordinary caution. The same caution any careful person exercises around tools or substances that reward correct use and punish careless use in roughly equal measure. The vessels themselves deserve a moment's attention, since the Infirmarer's choice of container was rarely accidental. Pottery, glazed on the interior, where the technique was available, held dried herbs and powders well, being easy to clean and resistant to absorbing unwanted odors between uses. Glass, costly and comparatively rare across most of the medieval period, was reserved where it existed at all, for the still room's more delicate work, tinctures and cordials whose clarity a careful infirmarer genuinely wanted to be able to check at a glance, watching for any cloudiness or unwanted change that might signal a preparation had spoiled or fermented past its intended strength. Horn, worked thin, and sometimes surprisingly translucent, provided a lighter, more portable alternative for smaller quantities carried from the cupboard to a patient's bedside, a small practical detail that shows, once again, just how much ordinary craft knowledge of pottery, of glass, of worked horn, fed quietly into the infirmarer's daily practice alongside his more obviously medical skills. A written record, where the house kept one, often hung near the cupboard, or was kept in a small book close at hand, noting what had been dispensed, to whom, and for what complaint. This practice, more common in larger and wealthier houses than in small rural priories, gave the infirmarer a kind of institutional memory beyond his own recollection. Useful when a chronic complaint returned after some months, and he needed to remember what had helped the same brother the previous winter. It is tempting, looking at these fragments of record, keeping that survive in a handful of monastic archives, to see in them the earliest, faintest outline of the patient records a modern clinic keeps today, the same basic impulse, expressed in a very different age, to remember carefully so that care can be given more wisely the next time it is needed. There was, too, a quieter craft to keeping the still room's work moving smoothly through the whole year, one that shows up only faintly in the surviving record, but that anyone who has ever kept a well-run kitchen or workshop will recognize instinctively. Nothing was allowed to run out unexpectedly if the infirmarer could help it. A steady mental inventory, checked and refreshed against the Physic garden's own seasonal calendar, told him roughly how much of each dried herb, each finished tincture, each jar of ointment remained, and roughly how long that supply would last against the community's ordinary needs before the next harvest could replenish it. Running short of a common remedy in the depth of winter, weeks before the garden could offer anything fresh, was the kind of quiet professional failure a careful infirmarer worked hard all year round to avoid, and this steady, anticipatory planning, invisible as it is in most of the surviving written record, was very likely one of the single most valuable skills the role actually demanded. And so the cupboard stood quiet and orderly, at the far end of a long chain that began in the Physic garden beyond the cloister wall and ran through the drying loft and the still room before finally arriving here, ready to be carried, a small jar or a stoppered bottle at a time, to whichever bed in the long infirmary hall needed it that day. It is a slow chain when you trace it all the way through, patient at every single link, And there is something genuinely soothing in simply following it from beginning to end, the way we have just done, without hurry, the way the monks themselves moved through it, season after season, for as long as these communities kept their gardens and their gentle, careful craft alive. There is a particular sound that belonged almost entirely to the infirmary, distinct from the sounds of the rest of the monastery, and it was the low, steady grinding of stone against stone, the mortar and pestle at work. Nearly every remedy that was not simply steeped or simmered passed at some point through this stage, and it is worth lingering on it a while, because the mortar tells us something quiet and important about the whole character of medieval medicine that is easy to miss if we move past it too quickly. The mortar itself was usually stone, sometimes marble in the wealthier houses, sometimes a dense local rock chosen for its hardness and its resistance to absorbing odors and flavors from one preparation to the next. A wooden mortar, easier to carve and cheaper to replace, was common in smaller and poorer houses, though the monks understood, even without any formal chemistry, that wood could hold on to the memory of strong-smelling herbs in a way that stone did not, and a careful infirmarer kept separate mortars for his most pungent ingredients, wormwood and rue especially, so their sharp character did not bleed into gentler preparations meant for delicate stomachs or troubled sleep. The pestle, shaped to fit the hand, and the particular curve of its matched mortar did the actual work, turning dried leaves, seeds, roots, and occasionally small crystalline minerals into the fine, even powder that so many recipes called for. Grinding by hand is slow work, slower than almost anyone today, accustomed to a blender or a food processor doing the same task in seconds, might easily imagine. A handful of dried betony leaves, reduced to the fine powder a wound dressing recipe might require, could take the better part of an hour of steady, patient circling of the pestle, the rhythm settling, after the first few minutes, into something almost meditative. Many of the surviving accounts of monastic daily life note, almost in passing, that this kind of repetitive manual labor, the grinding, the weeding, the copying of manuscripts in the scriptorium, was itself understood as a form of prayer, a way of occupying the hands and quieting the mind at the same time. And there is no reason to think the infirmarer's long hours at the mortar were any exception. Patience, the herb teaches us, and so does the stone. The stone itself, worn smooth over years of steady use, sometimes carried its own small history within a house, passed from one infirmarer to the next along with the office itself. The same mortar receiving the same patient, circling pressure from a whole succession of different hands across a whole succession of different decades. A few of these worn stone mortars survive even now in museum collections, their bowls polished glassy smooth by generations of grinding, quiet physical witnesses to exactly the kind of long, patient, repeated labor we have been describing together tonight. A labor that left almost no other written trace of itself beyond the stone it slowly wore down. Once ground, the powder became the base for several of the infirmary's most common preparations, chief among them the poultice. A poultice, in its simplest medieval form, was ground or crushed herb material, sometimes fresh and simply bruised rather than fully powdered, mixed with a small amount of warm water, wine, or occasionally a little flour or bread to bind it into a workable paste. Then applied directly to the skin, usually held in place with a strip of clean linen. Comfrey, again, appears here as one of the most consistently recommended plants across the surviving herbals. Its poultice applied to sprains, bruises, and the slow, stubborn wounds that resisted easy healing. The linen changed once or sometimes twice a day until the swelling eased or the wound began to close. A poultice of crushed cabbage leaf, simple as it sounds, was recommended in several surviving texts for drawing out the heat and swelling of an infected wound. An early and largely intuitive grasp of what we would now describe as an anti-inflammatory effect, arrived at through nothing more sophisticated than centuries of watching what actually seemed to help. Mustard, ground into a paste with a little warm water, produced a warming poultice used for chest complaints. The sharp heat of the mustard, applied over the breastbone and covered with a warm cloth, intended to draw blood and warmth to the area and ease the tightness of a lingering cough. The Infirmarer had to know, and teach whichever novice assisted him, exactly how long such a poultice could safely remain on the skin, since mustard applied too long could blister rather than simply warm, and this kind of practical, hard-won knowledge, the precise boundary between a helpful remedy and an accidental injury, formed a real and substantial part of what separated a skilled infirmarer from a well-meaning amateur working from memory alone. Beyond the poultice, the mortar's ground material went into the various small pills and lozenges that appear scattered through the medieval medical texts. Herb powder bound with a little honey into small, swallowable balls, useful for remedies that needed to be taken over several days without the trouble of preparing a fresh infusion each time. A cough lozenge of ground horehound and honey, allowed to slowly dissolve in the mouth, soothed a raw throat through a long winter in a way that would not feel entirely unfamiliar to anyone who has reached for a modern throat lozenge during their own winter cold. The continuity here, across nearly 1,000 years, is genuinely gentle to sit with for a moment. The specific plants have changed, and the theory behind their use has changed even more, but the basic, patient human impulse to soothe a sore throat with something sweet and herbal has apparently never really gone away. Powders were also used, quite simply, on their own, dusted directly onto wounds to help dry them and encourage healing, a practice that, again, has genuine grounding in how certain dried herbs, yarrow especially, do carry mild antiseptic and astringent properties. Yarrow, in fact, carries a Latin name, Achillea, that ties it directly to the legend of Achilles, said in ancient tradition to have used the plant to treat his soldiers' wounds on the battlefield, a story the monks would very likely have known through their classical education, and one that gave a plant already valued for good practical reasons an added layer of ancient authority, the kind of authority that mattered a great deal in a period when new medical claims were judged, in large part, by how well they matched what the old and trusted authorities had already said. The mortar's work extended, on occasion, beyond the still room and into moments of genuine emergency, though even here the infirmarer's approach remained as measured and unhurried as the surviving records allow us to judge. A sudden, severe wound, a fall from a ladder while repairing the roof, a serious burn from an overturned cooking pot, called for quick action rather than the ordinary slow rhythm of drying, grinding, and steeping we have described tonight. and a well-prepared infirmarer kept a small store of already finished preparations, ointments and powders ground and mixed well in advance, ready to hand for exactly this kind of unexpected need. This forward planning, itself a quiet form of patience extended across time rather than within a single afternoon, meant that even the infirmary's rare moments of genuine urgency were met, in practice, with the same calm, prepared competence that shaped every slower, more ordinary hour of the infirmarer's working day. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine the infirmarer's work at the Mortar and in the sick room as purely mechanical, a simple following of fixed recipes learned once and applied without variation. The surviving evidence, thin as it is in places, suggests real observation and real adjustment happening constantly, brother by brother, case by case. A remedy that suited one monk's stomach might unsettle another's, and a good infirmary learned, over years of close attention to the same small community, which brothers responded well to which preparations, adjusting his approach the way any experienced caregiver adjusts to the particular person in front of them, rather than to a textbook case alone. This individual attentiveness, built slowly over years of shared daily life within the same walls, was in some ways the infirmary's greatest and least documented strength, impossible to capture fully in any surviving manuscript, but visible, if you look closely, in the small variations and personal notes that occasionally survive in the margins of the recipe books themselves. The season of the year shaped this whole practice of minutio just as thoroughly as it shaped the Physic garden's own harvest, and it is worth pausing to notice how neatly the two calendars, garden and vein, actually fit together across the turning months. Spring bleeding, time to coincide with the first stirrings of new growth in the garden beds, was widely understood as a way of easing the body's own transition out of winter's heaviness, echoing, in its own bodily register, the same seasonal renewal visible in the fresh green shoots pushing up through the cold soil just beyond the infirmary wall. A late summer or early autumn bleeding, by contrast, was sometimes timed deliberately to prepare the body for the harder months ahead, a kind of seasonal fortification undertaken before the leaner, colder stretch of the year could take its usual toll. The infirmarer, holding both calendars in his head at once, moved between garden and lancet with the same unhurried, seasonally attuned rhythm in both, never treating one as separate from the other. Certain grinding tasks fell outside the ordinary run of herb powders altogether, and it is worth naming a few of them, since they show how widely the infirmarer's raw materials could range beyond the Physic garden itself. Chalk and certain soft, edible clays, gathered from particular local sources and trusted through long tradition, were sometimes ground fine and given to settle a badly troubled stomach, a remedy whose basic logic, a fine mineral powder absorbing excess acidity, survives today in a rather more refined form on any modern pharmacy shelf. Eggshell, cleaned and ground to a fine dust, appears in several surviving recipes intended to strengthen bone and restore vigor to an aged or weakened body. An intuitive, if imprecise, reach toward the same basic understanding of mineral nourishment that shapes how we think about diet and bone health now. None of this ground material went to waste or went unlabeled. Each small paper twist or linen packet, once prepared, took its place beside the herb powders in the cupboard, ready and waiting for the particular complaint it was known, through long tradition, to serve. Let us turn now to a practice that sounds, to modern ears, considerably more dramatic than the quiet grinding of the mortar, though in its own medieval context, it was treated with exactly the same calm, unhurried, almost routine attention, the letting of blood. Bloodletting occupied a central place in medieval medicine, monastic and secular alike, resting on the same broad theoretical framework that shaped the rest of the era's understanding of the body, the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile were understood to circulate through the body in a balance that, when disturbed, produced illness, and bloodletting, drawing off a measured quantity of blood, was understood as one of the most direct and reliable ways to restore that balance when it had tipped too far toward an excess of blood itself, a condition thought to produce fevers, headaches, and a whole range of related complaints. It is easy, from where we stand now, to see this as a crude or even harmful practice, and in certain circumstances, applied too aggressively or to an already weakened patient, it likely was. But within the monastery, bloodletting was practiced with a degree of caution, moderation, and careful calendar, keeping that set it apart, in tone at least, from some of the more aggressive bloodletting practiced elsewhere in medieval society. The monastic calendar for bloodletting, called minutio in the Latin of the period, followed its own fixed rhythm, distinct from the strictly medical question of whether any individual monk actually needed the procedure that season. In many Benedictine houses, the whole community, or at least the healthy majority of it, was bled several times a year as a matter of routine preventative practice, understood not as a response to illness already present, but as a way of maintaining balance before illness had the chance to take hold at all. 4 times a year was common in many customaries, roughly tied to the changing of the seasons, though the exact schedule varied from house to house and across the centuries. Those days set aside for minutio were treated, within the daily rhythm of the monastery, almost as small holidays. The brothers who had been bled that day were excused from some portion of their usual labor and from some of the stricter points of the rule, allowed extra food, sometimes meat, sometimes a little wine beyond the ordinary allowance, and permitted to rest in a way that the ordinary working day did not usually allow. There is something almost tender in this detail when you sit with it for a moment. A procedure we might now view with real unease was, within these walls, wrapped in an atmosphere of care, rest, and a small, permitted indulgence, treated less like an ordeal and more like a gentle seasonal reset for the whole body. The actual procedure was carried out by the Infirmarer himself in most houses, using a small blade called a lancet or a fleam, applied to a chosen vein, most often at the inside of the elbow. Though certain conditions called for bleeding from other specific points on the body, following a detailed and surprisingly elaborate system that mapped particular veins to particular ailments and to particular parts of the body they were believed to influence. This mapping was often illustrated in the surviving manuscripts by a figure known as the vein man or the zodiac man, a simple drawn human form marked with lines indicating where each vein connected, in the medical thinking of the age, to a particular organ, and in the zodiac man's case, to a particular astrological sign as well. The stars, in medieval medicine, as in so much else of medieval thought, were never entirely separate from the body's own workings, and a careful infirmarer consulted his calendar not only for the correct season, but in the more astrologically minded houses and periods, for the correct alignment of sun and moon with the appropriate sign before proceeding with the procedure at all. The amount of blood taken was measured carefully, usually into a small graduated bowl kept specifically for this purpose, and the infirmarer watched both the color and the manner in which the blood flowed as it was drawn, since both were understood to carry diagnostic meaning within the humoral framework. Blood that flowed dark and slow suggested one kind of imbalance. Blood that flowed bright and free suggested another. And the infirmarer adjusted the amount taken according to what he observed, stopping the procedure and applying a clean linen bandage, sometimes dressed with a little of the same comfrey or yarrow preparation used for other wounds, once he judged the correct quantity had been drawn. It is worth pausing here to note that bloodletting, in the specific and moderate form practiced within most monastic infirmaries, sits somewhat apart from the more extreme and repeated bleedings occasionally recorded elsewhere in medieval and even early modern medicine, the kind sometimes blamed, fairly or not, for worsening the condition of an already weakened patient. The monastic calendar, tied as it was to fixed and infrequent seasonal points for the healthy majority of the community, and applied with real caution and moderation by an infirmarer who knew his patients personally and observed them closely over years, seems to have functioned within its own theoretical framework, considerably more gently than its reputation in popular imagination might suggest. This is not to claim the practice had the medical benefit its practitioners believed it had. It very likely did not, at least not in the way they understood it. But the manner of its practice within these particular walls, unhurried, calendar-bound, wrapped in rest and extra food rather than urgency, tells us something genuinely useful about the broader character of monastic medicine as a whole. Even a practice we now regard with real skepticism was carried out here with a notable and consistent gentleness. Not every monk welcomed the calendar's arrival with equal calm, and the surviving records give us a few small, human glimpses of this. Some brothers, it seems, genuinely looked forward to minutio and the few days of gentler treatment that followed it, and a handful of customaries include gentle, almost affectionate warnings against those who seemed a little too eager for the extra food and rest that came with a bled arm, a small and very human wrinkle in an otherwise solemn medical practice. Others, by contrast, dreaded the lancet itself, and an experienced infirmarer, attentive as he was to the individual temperament of each brother in his care, learned to offer quiet reassurance and a steady, practiced hand to those who found the procedure genuinely frightening, talking calmly through the whole brief process the way a kind physician might still do today, understanding that a settled mind made for an easier and safer bleeding than a frightened one. The infirmarer kept his lancets carefully, cleaned and stored in their own small case, and passed the skill of using them correctly down to whichever brother seemed suited to eventually take up the role of infirmarer himself, since this, like so much else in the infirmary's daily work, was knowledge that lived primarily in practiced hands rather than on any single page, taught slowly over years, the way a craft has always been taught, by watching, by trying under close supervision, and, eventually, by doing the work alone while an older, steadier hand watched quietly from nearby, ready to correct a mistake before it became a real one. There is a final, quieter thread worth drawing out before we leave the mortar and the lancet behind and move on to the rest of tonight's walk. And it concerns the sheer, patient repetition that defined both of these particular crafts. A brother who took up the office of Infirmarer might, across 30 or 40 years of service, grind herbs at that same stone mortar tens of thousands of separate times, and perform the careful, seasonal work of minutio hundreds of times over, on hundreds of different arms, across decade after decade of the same steady, turning calendar. There is something worth sitting within the sheer scale of that repetition, the same simple, careful motions performed so many thousands of times that they must, by the end of such a long service, have become as natural and unthinking as breathing itself, each small act of grinding or bleeding folded so completely into the rhythm of the man's whole life that it would have been difficult, by his last years in the role, to say precisely where the skill ended and the man himself began. And so the calendar turned, season by season, minutio to minutio, the grinding of the mortar continuing in its own separate rhythm alongside it. And the whole slow machinery of the infirmary moved forward the way it always had, patiently, carefully, one measured procedure and one ground handful of powder at a time. Nothing in the infirmary happened without reference to the calendar. And it is worth spending a while now simply following that calendar all the way around, from one winter back to the next, because the shape of the whole medical year tells us almost as much about monastic healing as any single remedy could. The monastic year did not run on the same simple grid we use today, a plain sequence of numbered months, with no particular character of their own. It ran instead on the liturgical calendar, the long, layered cycle of feasts, fasts, and holy seasons that gave every week of the year its own particular flavor, its own permitted foods, its own rhythm of prayer, and, quite often, its own particular medical concerns as well. Advent and Lent, the two great fasting seasons of the church year, placed real strain on a body that ordinarily struggled through a medieval winter or early spring diet, even without additional restriction. And the infirmarer knew, from long experience, that these were reliably the seasons when the aged and the already weak members of his community needed the closest watching. It helps, before we walk the seasons themselves, to picture just how sharply the infirmary's population actually rose and fell across the year, since the surviving evidence suggests real, measurable variation rather than a simple, constant flow of patients. A quiet monastery of 30 brothers might see its infirmary hall host only 2 or 3 occupants through the gentler stretches of late spring and early summer, mostly the chronically frail, rather than the acutely ill, and yet find nearly a third of its whole community passing through those same beds at some point across a hard winter, whether for a lingering cough, a bout of chilblains, or simply the deep, bone-settled cold that troubled even otherwise healthy men through the darkest months. The infirmarer's own workload, in other words, breathed in and out with the seasons themselves, quiet and manageable through the warm months, considerably busier and more demanding through the cold ones, and his whole yearly rhythm of harvesting, drying, and storing was planned, in large part, precisely around meeting this predictable winter surge before it arrived. Winter itself, running roughly from the first frosts through to the thaw, brought its own predictable procession of complaints, and the Infirmarer's years settled into a rhythm shaped almost entirely around meeting them. Cause and chest complaints arrived first, as the weather turned and the unheated dormitory grew cold enough to trouble even a healthy chest, let alone an aging one. Chilblains, the painful itching swelling that comes from cold, damp extremities, particularly troubled the brothers, whose work kept them outdoors in the garden, at the mill, or tending the monastery's animals through the coldest months, and the Infirmarer's cupboard kept a steady, reliable supply of the same comfrey and calendula preparations already described, applied now to hands and feet rather than to garden injuries. Joint pain, worsened reliably by cold and damp, sent the older brothers to the infirmary in greater numbers as winter deepened, seeking the warming poultices, the willow bark decoctions for pain, and, most of all, simply the warmth of a room with an actual fire in it, a comfort the ordinary dormitory did not provide. The surviving account rolls of a handful of larger English houses, Westminster and Christ Church Canterbury among them. Let us see this winter pattern in genuinely specific detail, recording, year by year, exactly how much extra fuel was purchased for the infirmary hearth, how many additional measures of wine were drawn for the sick, and how the numbers of brothers admitted to the infirmary ward rose steadily as the season deepened before falling away again with the spring thaw. These are dry administrative documents in their original form, columns of figures kept by a monastery's treasurer or cellarer, and yet, read slowly, and with a little patience, they trace the same quiet, seasonal rhythm we have been describing tonight with real, dependable consistency, a whole community's health rising and falling with the turning of the year, faithfully recorded in ink by clerks who likely never imagined their careful bookkeeping would still be read, in a spirit of such gentle interest, so many centuries later. As winter began to loosen its grip and the first stirrings of spring appeared in the garden, a rather different set of concerns took over. Late winter and early spring, in an age before reliable long-term food storage, was often the leanest stretch of the whole year, the point at which the previous autumn stores had dwindled and the new season's growth had not yet arrived to replace them. Weakness, poor digestion, and the general depletion that comes from a long stretch of monotonous winter food. Salted and dried meat and fish, where it was permitted, hard bread, and little in the way of fresh green vegetables, called for what the old herbals often described as spring tonics, bitter herbs like nettle, dandelion, and watercress, some of the very first fresh green growth to appear after the winter, prescribed and eaten specifically to restore strength and cleanse what the medieval mind understood as a winter's accumulation of sluggish, stagnant humors. There is a real, if unintentional, wisdom buried in this practice. Nettle and dandelion, eaten fresh in early spring, are genuinely rich in exactly the vitamins and minerals a body running low on fresh food through a long winter would most need, and the monks, working from an entirely different theoretical framework, nonetheless arrived, through patient seasonal observation, at a practice that modern nutrition would recognize as sound. Spring itself, as the garden filled out, and the first bloodletting of the year traditionally took place in many houses, brought a season of general, gentle renewal to the infirmary's work, matching the wider renewal visible in the Physic garden beyond the cloister wall. This was often when the community's overall health, after the leanness of late winter, began genuinely to improve, and the infirmarer's daily labor shifted correspondingly from the urgent, chest-focused care of deep winter toward the steadier, more routine maintenance of a community moving, season by season, back toward its fuller strength. Summer brought its own distinct pattern of complaints, different again from winter's. Heat itself, and the exhaustion that comes with hard physical labor in the garden and the fields under a hot sun, particularly troubled the older brothers, and the infirmarer's cooling remedies, mint, elderflower, and rosewater among them, came into their heaviest seasonal use during these months. Insect stings and minor cuts from garden and field work, treated with the ever-reliable plantain, arrived in a steady, small but constant stream through the height of summer, the same small daily injuries any working community accumulates when its members spend long hours outdoors. Summer was also, notably, the season of the heaviest garden and drying loft work, the harvest that would carry the infirmary's medicine chest through the coming winter gathered now, in the long warm days, when the plant's oils and strength were understood to be at their fullest, and the hours of daylight allowed for the careful, unhurried harvesting the work required. Autumn, as the light shortened, and the last of the harvest was gathered in, brought its own particular character to the infirmary's year, part practical preparation and part quiet reflection. The final rounds of drying and storing filled much of the still room's work in these months. The drying loft at its fullest, the apothecary's cupboard restocked for the coming winter, the whole community's stores, medical and otherwise, laid in against the harder months ahead. Autumn was also, in many houses, a season of somewhat heightened mortality among the very old and the very weak, a pattern that would not have surprised the infirmarer, even without any formal understanding of why the transition into winter cold placed particular strain on already fragile bodies. This meant autumn, more than the other seasons, called on the infirmarer's other great skill, one we will return to more fully shortly, not the preparation of remedies at all, but the quiet, patient companionship of sitting with a brother whose body, despite every care given to it, was simply nearing the end of its long service. The great feast days scattered through this same calendar brought their own smaller, gentler medical rhythm as well. Christmas, Easter, and the other high points of the church year permitted a fuller diet, even for the healthy community, meat where it was otherwise forbidden, a better wine, a richer bread, and the infirmarer watched these days with a quiet, practical attention of his own, since a sudden return to richer food, after long weeks of fasting, could unsettle a stomach grown unaccustomed to it, particularly among the older brothers whose digestion had grown more delicate with age. A wise infirmarer kept a gentle digestive preparation close at hand through these festival stretches, fennel or mint most often, ready for the mild but predictable stomach trouble that reliably followed a feast day's generous table. A small, practical accommodation folded quietly into the joy of the wider celebration. Threaded through all 4 seasons, and returning with the same steady regularity as the seasons themselves, were the fixed points of monastic bloodletting already described. The feast days that brought their own permitted relaxations of diet and rule, and the great fasting seasons, Advent and Lent, that placed their own predictable strain on the community's collective health. A skilled infirmarer effectively held the whole shape of this calendar in his head at once, not as a set of separate, unconnected observations, but as a single, continuous, overlapping pattern. The liturgical year and the medical year woven together so completely that it would have made little sense, within the walls of the monastery, to try to separate the two. The moon, quite apart from its role in the more elaborate zodiac calculations already mentioned, held its own separate and widely observed influence over the timing of the garden's work as well, threading yet another layer of celestial rhythm through the infirmarer's already densely calendared year. Certain planting and harvesting tasks were traditionally undertaken in the waxing moon, when the old agricultural writers believed growth itself was favored, while root crops in particular were often lifted during the waning moon, when the plant's strength was thought to have drawn back down fully into the ground. This tradition, inherited largely from the much older Roman agricultural writer Palladius, whose own work on husbandry circulated widely in monastic libraries alongside the more strictly medical texts, meant the infirmarer's calendar was, in truth, at least 3 calendars layered carefully one upon another: the liturgical year of feast and fast, the medical year of bloodletting and seasonal remedy, and this older, quieter agricultural year of moon and season governing the garden itself, all 3 moving together, mostly in step, through every single week of his working life. It is worth noting, too, how this calendar connected the infirmary directly to the wider intellectual world beyond the monastery's own walls. The astrological and astronomical calculations that underpinned the more elaborate versions of the bloodletting calendar, the zodiac man and his mapped vines among them, drew on a body of knowledge that stretched back through Arabic and Greek sources, transmitted into Latin Europe through translation centers like the one at Toledo, and through scholars like Constantinus Africanus, who carried medical texts from North Africa to the great monastery of Monte Cassino in the 11th century, where they were translated and began to circulate through monastic libraries across the continent. The infirmarer, quietly grinding herbs in his still room in some small, remote house far from any city, was, in this sense, connected by a long, slow chain of texts and translations to physicians and scholars working centuries earlier and thousands of miles away, in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Cordoba. Their careful observations passed forward, hand to hand, copy to copy, until they reached him in a Latin text he could read by candlelight on a quiet winter evening. It is worth noting, finally, that this whole elaborate calendar, astrological calculation, and liturgical feast and agricultural moon phase, woven together into a single working system, never once struck the infirmarer himself, so far as the surviving evidence allows us to judge, as needlessly complicated or burdensome. He had, after all, known no other way of organizing time across his entire life within the monastery. From his earliest days as a young novice learning the canonical hours by heart to his later years, training his own eventual successor in the same overlapping rhythms. What reads to us now as an intricate, almost dizzying layering of different calendars was, to him, simply the ordinary shape of a year, as natural and unremarkable as the alternation of day and night, each thread of it reinforcing and confirming the others, rather than competing for his attention, the whole pattern turning steadily beneath him, the way the seasons themselves turned, whether he thought about it directly or not. This, perhaps more than any single remedy or procedure, is what the medical calendar of a medieval monastery really represents, not an isolated, superstitious system cut off from any real knowledge, but one particular, carefully maintained node in an extraordinarily long and international chain of observation and record-keeping, stretching backward through centuries and across an enormous geographic distance, all of it converging, in the end, on a single infirmarer in a single quiet room, doing his patient, careful best for the handful of brothers in his direct care. The calendar turned, and turned again, year after year, generation of infirmarers after generation, each one inheriting the accumulated patience of everyone who had held the office before him, and each one adding, in whatever small way, his own observation aloud to what the next infirmarer would eventually inherit in turn. There was, in nearly every medieval monastery of any real size, exactly one room where a fire was permitted to burn steadily through the cold months, apart from the kitchens and the infirmary hall itself. And that room was called the warming room, or in the Latin of the customaries, the calfactory. It deserves a slow visit tonight, because it tells us something gentle and easily overlooked about how these communities balance their famous austerity against the plain, unavoidable facts of a cold climate and an aging body. The wider monastic rule, in its stricter interpretations, treated physical comfort with real suspicion, understanding a degree of hardship, cold included, as part of the discipline that shaped a monk's character and turned his attention away from the body and toward the soul. And yet even the strictest houses recognized, in practice, that unrelieved cold through a long northern European winter was not virtue so much as simple harm, harm that served no one and helped nothing. And so the calfactory existed as a carefully bounded exception to the general rule, a single warm room where the whole community, not only the sick, could gather at set times to thaw hands too stiff and cold to hold a pen or turn the pages of a manuscript. The room itself was usually simple in construction, a single chamber, sometimes vaulted in stone for better fire safety, built around a substantial hearth, or, in some of the larger and wealthier houses, a proper fireplace of the kind that was still a genuine architectural rarity in this period. Benches lined the walls, close enough to the fire to feel its warmth, and the floor, like the infirmary hall, was often strewn with fresh rushes, sometimes scented with the same herbs used elsewhere in the monastery's medical work. The fire itself was carefully rationed, tended by a brother assigned specifically to the task, fed enough fuel to keep a steady, moderate warmth without the extravagance that the rule, even in its gentler moments, would not have permitted. Wood, in many regions, was a genuinely costly resource, gathered and cut through considerable labor, and the calfactory's fire represented a real, ongoing expenditure of the community's limited means, carefully weighed and judged worthwhile against the alternative of a whole community suffering through a hard winter with no relief at all. Access to the calfactory followed its own quiet rhythm, distinct from but connected to the infirmary's own calendar. In the ordinary run of the winter, the healthy monks were permitted to visit at set times, often twice a day briefly, to warm hands stiffened by cold before returning to the scriptorium, the cloister walk, or whatever labor the day required. The scribes in particular relied on this permitted warmth more than almost anyone else in the community, since copying a manuscript with numb, unresponsive fingers was slow, difficult, and prone to costly mistakes in books that represented weeks or months of careful labor. Several surviving manuscripts carry small marginal notes, added by the scribes themselves in moments of understandable complaint, mentioning the particular misery of copying through a cold winter. And it is not hard to imagine the same scribe's quiet relief at the sound of the bell that signaled permission to set down the pen for a short while and cross to the calefactory to work the stiffness out of his hands before the cold set into the ink itself and thickened it past usefulness. The very construction of the room, when we look closely at the surviving architectural evidence from a handful of well-preserved sites, reflects just how seriously these communities took the practical business of keeping a fire safely and efficiently. Thick stone walls held the heat far better than the timber construction common elsewhere in a monastery's outbuildings, and a carefully built chimney or smoke vent, itself no small feat of medieval engineering, drew smoke away cleanly enough that the room could remain genuinely comfortable to sit in for a long stretch of a winter afternoon, rather than filling with the choking haze that a poorly vented hearth would otherwise have produced. Some houses, the wealthier ones especially, invested in these details with real care, understanding, in their own practical way, that a warming room which failed to warm properly, or which filled with smoke every time the fire was fed, would fail entirely in the one purpose for which it had been built. For the aged and the infirm, though, the calefactory served a rather different and more sustained purpose, one closely tied to the infirmary's own work, even though the two rooms were usually physically separate. Brothers recovering from a recent bloodletting, already granted a period of rest and extra food under the customary allowances already described, were often permitted to spend that recovery time in the warming room rather than the colder dormitory. The fire's steady heat understood as a support to the body's recovery, gently sustaining the same restoration of balance the bloodletting itself had been intended to produce. The very old, whose circulation and general resilience against cold had genuinely weakened with age, sometimes received a more generous allowance of time in the calefactory than the ordinary rule permitted the healthy community. Another small, quiet example of how thoroughly the monastic system built in exceptions and accommodations for its most vulnerable members, even within a structure so generally defined by discipline and restraint. The particular date on which the fire was first lit each autumn was itself, in a number of houses, fixed by custom rather than left to the weather's own judgment, often tied to a specific feast day marking the formal turn of the year toward winter, a small ritual moment that the whole community would have quietly registered even if it warranted no special mention in the daily round of prayer. There was something steadying, one imagines, in this fixed, dependable arrival of warmth on the same reliable date each year, regardless of how hard or mild the season's first cold snap had actually been, a small promise kept by the community to itself, year after year. That comfort would come exactly when it always had. The calefactory also served, in a more social sense, as one of the few places within the strict silence of most monastic daily life where a limited, carefully bounded conversation was permitted. Many customaries specifically noted the calefactory, alongside the infirmary itself, as a place where necessary speech, kept brief and quiet, was allowed in a way the cloister walk or the dormitory did not generally permit. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because it means the warming room became, almost by accident of its practical purpose, one of the genuine social centers of the whole community, a place where an elderly brother, gathered close to the fire with 2 or 3 others in the same season of life, might share a few quiet words, a small memory, a brief moment of the ordinary human warmth that the wider discipline of the rule otherwise kept carefully restrained. Imagine, for a moment, that particular scene: 3 or 4 old men, their hands held out toward the same low fire, the room quiet except for the crackle of the wood and the occasional murmur of a sentence exchanged, and then left to settle unhurried into the general stillness of the room. There is a specific and genuine tenderness in this image, one that the surviving records only gesture toward in passing, in the brief permissions noted in a customary here or an account roll there, but one that feels, when you sit with it a while, entirely real and entirely human. There is a particular quality to firelight itself, quite apart from its warmth, that the calefactory offered its visitors, and it is worth pausing on for a moment, where the dormitory and much of the rest of the monastery sat through the winter evenings in a cold, near total darkness, broken only by whatever single candle the rule permitted. The calefactory's hearth threw a steady, moving, golden light across the room, gentler and less exact than a reading candle, but far more generous in its reach. For an old brother whose eyes had grown too weak for close reading by any light, this soft, ambient firelight offered one of the few remaining pleasures suited exactly to his failing sight, a warm room to simply sit in and watch the flames settle and shift, needing no book, no task, no particular effort of attention at all beyond the simple, restful act of watching a fire burn. The warming room's fire also served a handful of more practical, less obviously medical purposes that nonetheless connected back to the wider work of the infirmary. Wax for the infirmary's candles was sometimes softened and worked near the calefactory's steady heat. Linen bandages and dressings, washed after use, dried more quickly and reliably near this fire than they would have in the cold, damp air of an unheated room, an important practical consideration in an age before any understanding of germ theory made the connection explicit, though the plain, observed fact that clean, properly dried linen seemed to serve wounds better than damp linen was well understood through simple, accumulated experience, regardless of the underlying reason. Certain of the still room's preparations, particularly ointments that needed their base fat kept workably soft rather than hardened by cold, were sometimes finished or stored near the calefactory's warmth during the coldest months. One more small, practical thread connecting this single warm room to the whole quiet machinery of care running through the rest of the monastery. Some of the larger and better documented houses give us a slightly clearer picture of just how central this single room became to the whole community's winter life. Records from some of the great Benedictine and Cistercian houses of England and the continent describe calefactories large enough to hold a substantial portion of the community at once, with careful rules governing exactly how much fuel could be used and exactly which members of the community held priority access at which hours of the day. The abbot himself was, in most houses, entitled to warm himself there whenever he chose, but the customaries are notably careful in house after house, to specify that the sick, the aged, and those recently bled took precedence over the merely cold, healthy monk who simply wished for a moment's comfort, a small but telling detail about where the priorities of the whole system genuinely lay. Even the youngest members of the community, the child oblates and young novices who lived and studied within some monasteries under a somewhat gentler daily rule than the professed adult monks, found their own particular place within the calfactory's rhythm. Cold, cramped fingers make for poor handwriting and poor concentration in a child no less than in a grown scribe, and several surviving customaries for schools attached to larger monasteries specifically note permitted visits to the warming room for the boys in their care, a small, practical accommodation extended to the very youngest members of the community with the same unhurried, sensible logic that shaped every other part of this whole quiet system of care. By the time spring finally returned and the fire in the calfactory was allowed to burn down and, in many houses, was not relit again until the following autumn, the room had served its community through the hardest months in a way that went well beyond the simple provision of warmth. It had supported the recovery of the bled, and the resting eased the daily labor of the scribes, whose careful work filled the monastery's library and offered, in its quiet corner benches, one of the few permitted spaces for the small, warm, ordinary human connection that a life of discipline and silence otherwise kept so carefully restrained. When we speak of the medieval monastery's care for its sick and its aged, we are usually speaking, without quite naming it, of this same quiet, patient logic extended now beyond the infirmary hall itself and into this single, carefully tended fire, kept alight through the coldest months for exactly the people who needed it most. Let us turn now to a subject that touches nearly everything we have already walked through tonight, because so much of the infirmary's daily work eventually came back to the same basic question: what could be given to a weak or aging body to help it hold on to whatever strength it still possessed? Food, in the medieval infirmary, was itself a form of medicine, treated with exactly the same careful, deliberate attention as any herb from the Physic garden, and it deserves its own quiet stretch of tonight's walk. The ordinary monastic diet, under the strict interpretation of the rule of Saint Benedict, followed in one form or another across most of Western Europe, was deliberately plain and deliberately restrained. 2 cooked dishes at the main meal, a pound of bread, a modest measure of wine or oil, and, in most Benedictine houses, an outright prohibition on the meat of 4-footed animals for the healthy members of the community, except on the greatest feast days. This was not simply a matter of frugality, though frugality certainly played its part. It reflected a genuine spiritual conviction that restraint of the appetite disciplined the whole person, turning attention away from bodily comfort and toward the deeper work of prayer and contemplation that gave the monastic life its purpose. And yet, in the same breath, in the very same chapter of the rule, where Benedict laid down these restrictions, he made an explicit and carefully worded exception, one that the infirmarer would have known by heart and relied upon daily meat, and greater comfort generally, was to be freely given to the sick and the truly weak, because, as the rule itself puts it, the care of the sick must rank above every other consideration, so that the community may truly serve them as it would serve Christ himself. this single line. Quiet as it is within the much longer text of the rule, effectively created an entire separate dietary world within the infirmary, one governed by compassion and practical necessity rather than by the ordinary austerity that shaped the rest of monastic life. And it is worth sitting with the plain, generous clarity of that instruction for a moment before we walk further. In practice, this meant the infirmary kitchen, where a large enough house maintained one separate from the main monastic kitchen, prepared food according to an entirely different set of rules than governed the refectory. Meat broths, simmered slowly, sometimes for the better part of a day, formed the backbone of much infirmary cooking, valued not only for their nourishment, but for how easily a weak or elderly body could digest a well-made broth compared to solid meat or heavy bread. Chicken, when available, was particularly favored for this purpose, its broth considered gentle and strengthening at once, a judgment that, again, sits reasonably comfortably alongside modern nutritional thinking, even if the underlying medieval theory of humors would explain its benefit in entirely different terms. Beef and mutton broths appear as well in the surviving records, richer and heavier, reserved more often for brothers who needed real rebuilding of strength after a serious illness, rather than the gentler daily maintenance the frailest and oldest members of the community required. Bread, too, received its own quiet accommodation. The standard monastic loaf, made from whatever grain the region and season made available, could be coarse and difficult for a brother with failing teeth or a delicate digestion to manage comfortably. The infirmary kitchen, where it could, prepared a softer, finer loaf, sometimes made with a higher proportion of wheat flour than the community's ordinary bread, sometimes served soaked in broth or warm milk to soften it further for the oldest and frailest brothers, a small, practical kindness that appears again and again in the surviving customaries, described without any particular fanfare, simply as the plain, sensible way things were done for those who needed it. Wine and all, too, moved beyond their ordinary modest allowance within the infirmary's walls. A weak or convalescing brother often received a somewhat more generous measure than the healthy community's daily portion, sometimes warmed and spiced with a little honey and ginger, understood as both a source of gentle strength and a genuine comfort, particularly through the cold months when a warm, spiced drink offered real relief from a chill that plain water or thin ale could not provide. Honey itself, produced in the monastery's own hives in most well-established houses, found its way into a great deal of infirmary cooking beyond its use in the still room's syrups, stirred into warm milk, spread on the softened bread already described, or simply offered on its own as a small, sweet comfort to a brother whose appetite had otherwise failed him almost entirely. Fruit, where the monastery's own orchards or gardens could provide it, and where trade with neighboring houses or the surrounding region made it available outside the growing season in the form of dried apples, pears or figs, was another area of real accommodation for the sick and the aged. Fresh fruit in season, gently cooked or stewed, where a weak digestion could not manage it raw, and dried fruit through the leaner months, provided both nourishment and, we might guess, a genuine small pleasure in a diet that otherwise consisted so heavily of bread, broth, and the plainer garden vegetables. There is something worth noticing in how consistently the surviving records return to this theme of small, deliberate pleasure folded into medical necessity. The honey, the dried fruit, the spiced warm wine, the softened bread, all of it prescribed with the same careful attention given to a bitter medicinal decoction, as if the Infirmarer and the wider community genuinely understood, centuries before anyone would frame it in quite these terms, that comfort and pleasure were themselves a real and legitimate part of healing, not a frivolous distraction from it. This special dietary allowance carried a specific name in the customaries of several religious orders, the misericord, from the Latin word for mercy, referring both to the exception itself and, in some houses, to a specific room set apart from the main refectory, where those receiving this gentler diet could eat without disturbing the strict observance of the healthy community around them. The word choice matters. This was not framed, in the language the monks themselves used, as weakness or as a lesser standard grudgingly permitted. It was framed explicitly as mercy, a virtue in its own right, freely and deliberately extended to those whose bodies could no longer bear the full weight of the ordinary rule, and receiving it carried no shame within the logic of the system that granted it. Milk, too, played a quietly important part in this gentler infirmary diet, particularly for the very old and the very frail whose teeth and digestion could manage little else. Warmed milk, sometimes thinned further with a little water for the weakest patients, sometimes thickened instead with a spoonful of fine oatmeal into a soft, easily swallowed gruel, appears repeatedly in the surviving infirmary accounts as a staple of the misericord table, valued for how gently it sat with a failing stomach and how easily it could be flavored, with a little honey or a pinch of cinnamon where the spice could be had, into something genuinely comforting rather than merely nourishing. A small dairy herd, kept by many monasteries specifically for this purpose, alongside the community's wider agricultural work, meant this particular comfort could usually be relied upon through most of the year, one more quiet, steady thread in the whole patient fabric of infirmary care. The aged brothers, specifically, occupied a particular and carefully considered place within this whole framework, distinct in some ways from the simply and temporarily ill. A monk who had spent 40, 50, sometimes 60 years within the same community, who had served as a young novice under an infirmarer, who might himself now be an old man, cared for in that same infirmary, held a kind of standing that the customaries and account rolls of several houses explicitly acknowledge. Some monasteries maintained what amounted to a permanent allowance of the gentler infirmary diet for their oldest members, regardless of any specific illness, simply on the recognized grounds of advanced age itself. An early and genuinely thoughtful acknowledgement that the ordinary demands of the rule were not meant to be applied with identical rigor across every stage of a long human life. Seating, too, quietly reflected this same careful attention to the needs of age. In the refectory itself, where the healthy community took its meals in a fixed order determined by seniority within the community, the oldest brothers held, by long custom, places of honor near the head of the hall, close to the reader whose voice carried the day's designated text over the meal, and close enough to the kitchen serving hatch that a slower, weaker set of hands need not struggle to pass dishes down a long, crowded table, where age or infirmity kept a brother from the refectory altogether. Food was carried to him instead, warm, in the infirmary or the misericord room, so that even total physical separation from the healthy community's own table never meant separation from the community's basic, steady rhythm of shared meals and shared care. The daily texture of this care went well beyond diet alone, though diet gives us perhaps the clearest documented window into it. Aged brothers were commonly excused from the harder manual labor that had filled their younger years, reassigned instead to lighter tasks, suited to failing strength, tending a small portion of the garden perhaps, or assisting with lighter work in the scriptorium, if their eyes still permitted close reading, work that kept them engaged and useful within the life of the community, rather than simply set aside. The night office, that demanding rhythm of prayer that pulled even healthy young monks from sleep in the depths of the night, was frequently softened or entirely excused for the oldest and frailest members, a recognition that the body's need for rest in advanced age had to take real precedence over even the deeply held obligations of the rule itself. Clothing, too, received its own quiet accommodation within this same general spirit of mercy. The standard monastic habit, plain wool, was worn year-round by the healthy community, with little variation beyond a heavier layer added for winter, but the aged and the infirm were often permitted softer undergarments, an extra layer against the cold, or shoes better suited to failing feet than the simple sandals the rule ordinarily prescribed. None of this was framed as indulgence. It followed the same basic logic that shaped every other exception we have discussed tonight. A body weakened by age or illness required and deserved a gentler accommodation than the ordinary rule provided for the strong, and providing it was understood as an act of care rather than a compromise of discipline. Some of the larger houses formalized this care still further, maintaining a distinct and separate establishment, sometimes described in their records as the house for the aged, set a little apart from the main infirmary and reserved specifically for brothers who were no longer acutely ill but who simply required, by virtue of their years, a permanently gentler pace of life than the working community around them could easily accommodate. These arrangements, glimpsed only in fragments across a handful of surviving charters and account books, suggest an institution thinking carefully and deliberately about the particular needs of long-term aged care, rather than folding it in, almost as an afterthought, alongside the treatment of acute and temporary illness, a distinction that feels, even now, like a genuinely thoughtful piece of institutional design. It is worth pausing to notice, too, how this care extended a kind of continuity and dignity across an entire long life lived within these walls. A monk who entered as a boy or a young man, who labored through decades of ordinary discipline, who perhaps served for a time as Infirmarer himself, tending to others through his own most vigorous years, could reasonably expect, by the plain evidence of the surviving customaries, to be received in turn into the same gentle, patient care he had once given, cared for by a younger infirmer in the same rooms, fed the same softened bread and warmed wine, seated by the same fire in the calefactory, that he himself had once carried to some other old brother, decades earlier, in the same unbroken chain of care passed down and repaid across an entire lifetime, lived inside a single small community. The dishes themselves, plain as they generally were, still carried small variations worth naming, since the surviving kitchen accounts of a handful of houses list them with a specificity that lets us picture the misericord table with real clarity. A pottage of leeks and barley, simmered soft and long, formed a common base for many infirmary meals, easily thickened with a little extra grain for a brother needing more sustained strength, or thinned further with additional broth for one whose stomach could manage very little at all. Eggs, gathered from the monastery's own hens, appeared regularly on this gentler table as well, soft-boiled or made into a simple, easily digested custard sweetened with honey, valued as a light but genuinely nourishing food suited to exactly the kind of frail appetite so common among the infirmary's oldest and weakest residents. This, perhaps, is the quiet heart of what the misericord and the whole system of accommodation for the aged really represents. Not a grudging exception carved reluctantly out of an otherwise harsh discipline, but a considered, deliberate, and genuinely humane recognition that a long life of service deserved, at its ending, exactly the gentleness it had itself once helped to provide for others. The bread was softened, the wine was warmed and sweetened with honey. The fire in the cow factory was kept a little longer for the old man whose hands had grown too cold to hold his beads without it, and all of this, taken together, formed as real and as carefully maintained a part of the monastery's medical practice as any herb grown in the Physic garden or any remedy ground in the quiet stillness of the still room. We come now to the part of tonight's walk that asks for the gentlest attention of all, because the infirmary was not only a place where brothers recovered and returned to their ordinary life within the community. It was also, quite often, the place where a long life within these walls finally came to its close, and the medieval monastery approached this final stage of care with the same patient, unhurried attention it gave to every other part of the infirmarer's work. When it became clear, through the slow accumulation of small signs, that an experienced infirmarer learned to read over years of close observation, that a brother's illness or advanced age had entered its final stage, the whole rhythm of his care shifted, gently and without alarm, from the pursuit of recovery toward the different and equally serious work of accompaniment. The surviving customaries from several of the great houses, Cluny among the most thoroughly documented, describe this transition with a care and specificity that tells us how seriously the whole community treated it. This was never regarded as a failure of medicine, a point where the infirmarer's earlier work had simply run out of options and been abandoned. It was understood instead as the natural and expected final stage of the same continuous care that had begun, in a sense, the very day a young novice had first entered the community decades earlier. The dying brother was, in most well-documented houses, moved, if he was not already there, into the infirmary itself, placed in a bed positioned, where the architecture allowed it, within clear sight or hearing of the small altar at the end of the hall, so that the sacraments and the sound of prayer could reach him easily and without disturbance to the rest of the ward. A larger candle than the ordinary infirmary allowance was often kept burning near his bed, both practically, so that a brother sitting with him through the night hours could see clearly enough to offer whatever small comfort was needed, and symbolically, the steady flame understood within the rich visual language of medieval devotion as a quiet echo of the soul's own continuing light, even as the body itself grew weaker. Word of a brother's approaching death spread quietly through the community, and the customaries describe, in house after house, a genuine and deliberate gathering of the brethren around him in his final hours, understood not as a somber duty to be endured, but as one of the most important acts of communal life a monastery could perform. The whole community, or as many as could reasonably be spared from essential duties, would come to sit with him in shifts, murmuring the psalms, keeping a steady, quiet presence at his bedside so that, so far as it was humanly possible to arrange, no brother within these walls died entirely alone. This practice, described in Latin texts of the period under the term commendatio animae, the commending of the soul, involved a specific sequence of prayers recited at the bedside, calm and familiar words that many of the brothers gathered there would have heard recited. In this exact context, many times before across their own decades within the community, words that had, by long repetition, become as much a comfort to the living as to the dying man, they were spoken over. The infirmarer's role in these final hours extended too, to a kind of quiet honesty that the surviving accounts suggest was genuinely valued within this system rather than avoided. Where a physician in a later, more secular tradition might have felt pressure to offer false reassurance or to keep a failing prognosis from the patient himself, the monastic understanding of death as a natural and even welcome final stage of a well-lived life meant the infirmarer could speak plainly when a dying brother asked him directly how his condition stood, without the same fear of causing despair that might trouble a caregiver in a less settled spiritual framework. This honesty, offered gently and without alarm, allowed the dying brother himself to prepare consciously for what was coming, to settle his own remaining wishes, to make his peace with the brothers around him, and to participate, so far as his strength allowed, in his own final rites, rather than being kept, as sometimes happens even now, in an uncertain and frightening ignorance about his own condition. Practical comfort continued alongside this spiritual accompaniment, and it is here that the infirmarer's long medical experience found its final, quiet application. Pain, where the dying brother suffered it, was eased as much as the age's limited means allowed, sometimes with the strongest preparations the apothecary's cupboard held. A carefully measured dose of poppy preparation among the more serious house's resources, used sparingly and with real caution through most of a brother's illness, but permitted more freely in these final hours when the earlier concern about dependency or excessive sedation simply no longer applied in the same way. Warmth was maintained, the same careful attention to a comfortable bed and adequate blankets that had shaped the whole infirmary's ordinary care, and the dying man's lips and mouth, often too dry and weak by this stage to manage a full drink, were moistened gently and frequently with small sips of watered wine or a sweetened herbal infusion, a small, physical kindness repeated as often as it was needed through the final hours. Beyond the commendatio animae itself, the Cluniac customaries in particular describe a further, quietly moving detail of this final accompaniment as death drew very near. The brothers gathered at the bedside would, in some houses, gently lay the dying man upon a bed of ashes or a simple hair cloth spread over the mattress. A last physical echo of the humility and plainness that had shaped the whole of his monastic life, offered now not as any hardship, but as a final, deliberate act of solidarity with the ordinary discipline he had followed for so many decades. A processional cross was sometimes brought and held where the dying brother could see it, and the litany of the saints, a long, rhythmic list of names recited aloud, one after another, accompanied the very last stretch of the vigil, the repetition of the litany's steady cadence offering. One imagines a kind of accompanying rhythm not unlike the slow, repeated breathing of someone drifting gently towards sleep. The moment of death itself, when it came, was met within the monastic community with a specific and immediate response, one that tells us a great deal about how thoroughly this whole final stage of life had been folded into the ordinary rhythm of communal practice, rather than treated as a disruption to it. The great bell of the church, the same bell that called the community to prayer at every hour of the day and night, was rung in a particular pattern reserved for exactly this moment, announcing to the whole monastery, and often to the surrounding village or estate as well, that a brother had died. The body was washed and prepared by the brothers assigned to this task, dressed in a simple habit kept specifically for burial, and carried, usually within a day, to the church, where it lay before the altar through a further period of prayer and vigil before the burial itself. The particular brothers who kept vigil through these final hours were not chosen at random, either in houses that documented the practice with any real care. A brother who had shared a particular closeness with the dying man across their years of shared life, a fellow novice from decades earlier, a former pupil now grown old in his own right, or simply a brother known for the particular gentleness and steadiness that this final kind of accompaniment required, was often specifically sought out and asked to keep the longest or most difficult stretches of the vigil, the deep hours before dawn especially, when the surviving accounts suggest death most often came. This quiet, deliberate matching of temperament to task, so consistent with everything else we have observed tonight about how these communities organize their care, meant that even in this last and most solemn of duties, a dying brother was as likely as circumstances allowed to be accompanied by precisely the voice and the presence that would bring him the most genuine comfort. The burial ground of a medieval monastery, most often a quiet plot close by the church itself, held generations of brothers in this way. The newest grave dug close by the graves of monks who had died decades earlier, some of whom the newly deceased brother might himself have known as an old man when he first entered the community as a young novice. There is a real, unbroken continuity in this image, one worth sitting with for a moment, an entire community's worth of lives, each one cared for through illness and old age by the same patient infirmary system, each one finally laid to rest within sight of the same cloister garden, the same Physic garden, the same warming room that had sustained them through their own long years of service. News of a monk's death was also, in many well-connected monastic networks, carried outward to sister houses across considerable distances, sometimes by a messenger sent specifically for the purpose, sometimes through a written mortuary roll, a rolled parchment carried from monastery to monastery, each house adding its own brief note of prayer and remembrance before passing the roll onward to the next. Some of these rolls survive today, carrying the names and brief notices of monks who died many centuries ago, their final journey across a network of related houses recorded, quite literally, in the same careful hand and the same patient spirit that shaped everything else we have walked through together tonight. One more thread connecting a single quiet death in a single remote infirmary to a much wider, much longer community of memory and prayer. What strikes a modern reader most, perhaps, encountering these old accounts of monastic death for the first time, is how thoroughly absent any sense of crisis or emergency seems to be from the whole process. Death, within this particular framework, was neither hidden away nor treated as a failure to be minimized. It was met, instead, with the same unhurried, patient, carefully ordered attention given to every other part of monastic life, from the daily rhythm of prayer to the seasonal calendar of the Physic garden, folded into the same continuous rhythm, rather than standing apart from it as something separate or frightening. A dying brother was not abandoned to face his final hours alone in a curtained corner, while the rest of the community continued about its business elsewhere. He was, so far as the surviving evidence allows us to judge, held closely at the very center of communal attention in exactly those final hours, surrounded by familiar faces, familiar prayers, and the same quiet, patient care that had, in one form or another, accompanied him through every other stage of his long life within these walls. It is worth adding, too, that this care extended a little beyond the moment of death itself, into the weeks and months of remembrance that followed. Many houses maintained a formal necrology, a book in which the date of each brother's death was carefully recorded, to be read aloud on its anniversary each year, so that the whole community, including brothers who had never personally known the deceased, would continue to pray for him by name for as long as the monastery itself endured. In this way, the same patient, careful record-keeping that shaped the infirmary's medical practice, the labeled jars, the noted remedies, the calendar of bloodletting, extended finally into this last quiet act of remembrance, a final, careful entry made in a steady hand, ensuring that no brother who had lived and died within these walls would simply be forgotten once his particular illness had run its course and his particular bed in the infirmary hall had been made ready, quietly, for whoever might need it next. Let us step, for a while, outside the community of the brothers themselves, because the infirmary's quiet work did not stop entirely at the monastery's own walls. Tonight we turn to the travelers, the pilgrims, and the ordinary sick of the surrounding countryside who, in one way or another, so often found their way to the same gentle care we have been walking through this evening. The rule of Saint Benedict, in one of its most often quoted chapters, instructs that all guests arriving at the monastery gate should be received as though they were Christ himself. A simple, direct instruction that shaped the practical daily life of monastic houses across the whole of medieval Europe for centuries. Hospitality, in this sense, was never treated as an optional kindness extended when convenient. It was a fixed and serious obligation, woven into the architecture of the monastery itself through the guest house, usually positioned near the main gate, and through the office of the almoner, the monk specifically charged with overseeing the community's care for the poor, the traveling, and the sick who arrived asking for help. The gatehouse itself, where the almoner and his assistants carried out much of this first meeting with the outside world, was often among the more carefully built and carefully staffed structures in the whole monastic complex, a recognition of just how central this point of contact between the enclosed community and the wider world genuinely was to the monastery's own sense of its purpose. A bell at the gate, distinct from the great bells that governed the community's own internal rhythm of prayer, summoned the almoner whenever a traveller arrived, day or night, since the obligation of hospitality, as the rule made plain, admitted no convenient exceptions for an inconvenient hour. Not every visitor who came to the gate was well, and a monastery of any real size, situated as many were along the major pilgrim roads that crisscrossed medieval Europe, connecting the great shrines of Compostela, Canterbury, Rome, and countless smaller local sites, saw a steady stream of travelers whose journeys had left them exhausted, injured, or genuinely ill by the time they reached the gate. The almoner's first task, in these cases, was simple triage of a kind that would not feel entirely foreign to a modern reader, assessing whether a visitor needed only food, rest, and a night's shelter before continuing their journey, or whether their condition called for the more sustained attention of the infirmarer and a bed within the infirmary itself. Where the latter was needed, many larger houses maintained a separate section of the infirmary, or occasionally an entirely separate small building near the gate, set apart specifically for sick travelers and the local poor, distinct from the ward that housed the brothers of the community. This arrangement served a practical purpose, keeping the community's own routine and its own patients' recovery undisturbed by the different needs and different circumstances of outside visitors. But it also reflects something genuinely important about how these institutions understood their obligation. The infirmarer's medical skill, the whole slow apparatus of the Physic garden, the still room, and the apothecary's cupboard was never regarded as a resource reserved exclusively for the brothers themselves. It was, in the language the monks themselves used, a form of charity extended outward, as a matter of course, to anyone in genuine need who reached the gate. Some monasteries, particularly the larger and wealthier houses, situated along the busiest pilgrim routes, developed a considerable local reputation for exactly this kind of care, and the surviving records of a handful of these houses give us a genuine, if fragmentary, sense of the scale involved. Guest rolls and account books from several English and continental monasteries record dozens, occasionally hundreds, of sick travelers received and treated over the course of a single year. A volume of work that must have placed real, sustained demand on the infirmarer's stores and his own patient attention, stretched now well beyond the needs of his own small community of brothers. It is worth imagining, for a moment, what this must have meant in practice, a Physic garden planted and tended not only for the predictable, familiar needs of 30 or 40 brothers, whose particular constitutions the infirmarer had come to know intimately over years, but for the unpredictable, constantly shifting needs of strangers, arriving daily from every direction, each one carrying a different complaint, a different history, a different body the infirmarer had never seen before and might never see again. Pilgrims specifically, traveling toward one of the great shrines in hope of a cure for some chronic or serious ailment that ordinary medicine of the age had failed to relieve, formed a particular and recurring category among these visitors. A monastery fortunate enough to hold its own relic of some regard, a fragment associated with a local saint, a small piece of the true cross, or simply a particularly venerated tomb, often found itself, quite apart from any deliberate plan, becoming a genuine local center of both spiritual and medical hope. The two categories blurred together in the medieval mind in ways that can feel unfamiliar to us now, but that made complete and coherent sense within the framework these communities actually lived by. A sick pilgrim arriving at such a house might spend the night in prayer near the relic, hoping for the sudden, miraculous cure that the surviving accounts of several shrines do genuinely record happening, at least in the understanding of those who witnessed and wrote down these events, while also, in the meantime, receiving the entirely ordinary, entirely practical care of the Infirmarer's herb garden and still room. The miraculous and the medicinal offered side by side, without any sense that one somehow competed with or undermined the other. Some houses, over the centuries, grew this outward-facing work into something considerably larger and more formally organized than the simple gatehouse care we have described so far. The great hospital orders that developed across the 12th and 13th centuries, drawing directly on the same monastic model of infirmary care we have spent this evening exploring, built entire institutions specifically devoted to the care of travelers, the poor sick and pilgrims, some of them growing to a scale that would not feel entirely unfamiliar to a modern visitor walking through a large hospital ward today. These larger foundations kept their own extensive gardens, their own trained infirmarers, and their own detailed rules of care, all directly descended, in spirit and in practical method, from the same quiet Benedictine infirmary tradition that had first developed the Physic garden, the still room, and the patient, calendar-bound rhythm of care we have followed together tonight. The almoner's work extended, too, into the surrounding village and countryside directly, well beyond the monastery's own gate. Many houses maintained a regular practice of distributing food, and where the need called for it, simple remedies to the sick poor of the local area, sometimes through a fixed weekly distribution, sometimes through more informal visits carried out by the almoner or a brother working under his direction. This outward flow of medical knowledge and practical help created, over the long centuries these institutions endured, a genuine and lasting connection between the specialized, carefully documented medicine practiced within the monastery walls and the more informal, orally transmitted folk medicine practiced by village healers, midwives, and the ordinary heads of rural households across the surrounding region. A remedy first written down in a monastic herbal, drawn ultimately from a classical text like Dioscorides, and refined through generations of the infirmarer's own careful observation, could, through this quiet, patient exchange at the monastery gate, find its way into the working knowledge of a village-wise woman who had never learned to read a single word of Latin herself, passed along instead through simple, spoken instruction. A bundle of the right dried herb and a demonstration of how it ought to be prepared. The almoner's careful daily accounting of this outward charity, where it survives, gives us a genuinely specific window into just how much was quietly given away in the ordinary run of a single year. Bread counted by the loaf, all by the measure, and the smaller. Harder to quantify gifts of dried herbs and simple remedies handed across the gate to whichever villager had walked up that particular morning with a sick child or an aching joint, all of it recorded, where the house kept careful books with the same patient, unhurried precision given to every other part of the monastery's accounts. It is worth remembering that this charity was never treated as separate from or secondary to the community's own religious life. It was, in the plainest and most direct sense the monks themselves would have used, one of the central purposes for which the whole institution existed at all, alongside prayer, alongside labor, alongside the slow copying of manuscripts we will turn to shortly. This two-way exchange, it is worth noting, ran in both directions, rather than only outward from the monastery. Local knowledge, gathered from the surrounding countryside, over generations of practical necessity, sometimes found its own way back into the infirmarer's own working practice, a particular local application of a common plant, a specific preparation favored by the village midwives for easing a difficult childbirth, occasionally noted and incorporated into the monastery's own accumulated store of remedies. The infirmary, in this light, functioned not as an isolated, purely academic repository of classical medical learning sealed away behind the cloister wall, but as one active, continuously exchanging node within a much wider, looser network of medical knowledge that spanned the whole of medieval society. From the great cathedral schools and their learned physicians down to the smallest rural household, and its own carefully remembered store of practical remedies. Occasionally, the surviving records let us glimpse a specific traveler rather than only the general pattern of hospitality, and these fragments are worth pausing over. Pilgrim accounts from the period where they survive sometimes mention by name a particular monastery whose infirmary care left a lasting impression, a fever broken after several days of careful nursing, a badly infected foot saved from a much worse outcome through the patient daily attention of an infirmarer, whose name the grateful traveler troubled to record, when so many other details of the same long journey went entirely unmentioned. These small, personal notices, rare as they are among the vast bulk of more impersonal administrative record-keeping, offer us something the account rolls alone cannot, a genuine, individual sense of what this care actually felt like from the receiving end, gratitude carried forward, sometimes literally to the ends of a pilgrim's own written account of their journey, for a kindness shown by strangers who expected nothing in return, beyond the simple fulfillment of their own community's oldest and most fundamental obligation. A traveler's welcome, moreover, did not end at food and physic alone. The guest master, working alongside the almoner, saw to a clean bed, a chance to wash away the dust and weariness of the road, and, where the traveler's own clothing had suffered through a long journey, occasionally a change of simple linen, while their own garments were cleaned and dried by the same fire that warmed the cow factory. It is a small detail, easy to overlook among the grander claims of medieval hospitality, but it speaks to the same thorough, practical attentiveness we have seen in every other corner of the infirmary's work tonight, a recognition that comfort and dignity, offered in small physical ways, mattered every bit as much to a stranger's recovery as any herb drawn from the Physic garden. By the time evening fell and the gate was closed for the night, following the same fixed daily rhythm that governed every other part of monastic life, the day's visitors, whether cured, comforted, simply fed, or settled into a bed in the infirmary's traveller's ward for a longer stay, had each carried something of the monastery's quiet, patient care back out into the wider world with them. Whether that meant only a full stomach and a night's rest before continuing their journey, or a genuinely improved constitution, or, in the case of the pilgrims among them, whatever measure of spiritual comfort their visit to the shrine had provided. The Physic garden beyond the cloister wall, tended so carefully through every season we have already walked through together tonight, gave its harvest, in the end, not only to the brothers who lived within these walls, but, in a slow and steady trickle carried outward through the gate, to the whole surrounding world that the monastery had quietly chosen as a matter of its own deepest principles, never entirely to shut out. There is a particular pleasure, I think, in simply naming things slowly, one after another, and letting each one settle before moving to the next. So let us spend a while doing exactly that. Walking now through some of the common, ordinary complaints that filled the Infirmarer's days, and the equally ordinary remedies he kept ready for each one. Before we walk through these familiar complaints one by one, it is worth pausing on the sheer, quiet consistency of how the Infirmarer approached every single one of them, whatever the specific ailment happened to be. Observe closely, consult the herbal, where memory alone was not enough. Choose the gentlest effective remedy the cupboard held. Apply it with patience, and watch carefully for whether it helped, adjusting the approach the following day if it did not. This same simple, unhurried sequence, repeated countless times across an Infirmarer's working life, forms a kind of quiet backbone running beneath every single fact we are about to walk through together, and it is worth carrying that steady rhythm with you as we go. Toothlick brought a steady, familiar stream of sufferers to the infirmary door in an age before any real dentistry beyond simple extraction existed. Oil of cloves, where the costly imported spice was available, was pressed directly against an aching tooth for its genuinely numbing effect, a remedy so reliably useful that it survived, in various forms, in ordinary household medicine cabinets for centuries afterward, right up until relatively modern times. Where cloves were too dear or too scarce, a strong infusion of sage, held in the mouth and swished gently over the offending tooth, offered a milder, but still genuinely helpful relief. Sage's astringent, mildly antiseptic properties doing real, if modest, work against the inflamed gum tissue so often at the root of the pain. Irritch, another common and genuinely miserable complaint, particularly among the youngest members of the wider community, the monastery sometimes served, called for a few drops of warmed oil, sometimes plain olive oil, sometimes infused first with a little mullein flower or garlic, dropped gently into the affected ear and held in place with a small twist of wool. The warmth itself brought real comfort, and garlic in particular carries genuine antimicrobial properties that likely offered some real benefit against the infections so often behind a persistent irritchy. Though the Infirmarer, working from his own theoretical framework, would have explained its usefulness in terms of the herb's inherent hot, drying quality rather than anything resembling modern microbiology, eye trouble, from simple irritation and mild infection to the more serious clouding of vision that came with age, received its own careful attention. Rosewater, distilled slowly and patiently in the still room from the same roses grown partly for the church altar, was dabbed gently onto tired or irritated eyes. Its mild, cooling astringency offering real, if temporary, relief. Fennel water, similarly prepared, appears repeatedly across the surviving herbals as a remedy specifically for eyes grown weak or dim with age. and while it could not, of course, restore vision genuinely lost to the cataracts and other conditions that no medieval remedy could touch, the gentle, patient application of a cool, soothing wash was itself a real comfort to an old brother whose failing sight had become, quietly, one of the harder burdens of his advancing years. Digestive complaints, unsurprisingly given the plain, often monotonous medieval diet, filled a considerable portion of the infirmarer's ordinary daily work. A settled, unhappy stomach after a heavy meal called most often for the simple mint or fennel infusion already mentioned, gentle and quick to prepare. More serious digestive upset, the kind that today we might attribute to food that had spoiled in storage or water drawn from a less than perfectly clean source, called for stronger measures, sometimes a decoction of dried blackberry root or oak bark, both valued for their strongly astringent properties in settling a troubled gut. Constipation, a persistent enough complaint across the surviving medical literature of the period that it clearly troubled a great many people, was treated with gentle purgatives. Senna, where it could be obtained through trade, or the more commonly available flax seed, soaked and taken with plenty of warm water, a remedy that, again, holds up reasonably well against modern understanding of how soluble fiber supports digestion. Skin complaints of every ordinary kind, burns from the kitchen fire, scrapes and cuts from garden and field labor, the persistent itching of various minor skin conditions found their steady, reliable answer in the calendula and comfrey preparations already described at length, alongside plantain for stings and minor wounds, and a paste of ground oats and honey, gentle enough for even the most sensitive and irritated skin, applied and left to work through a quiet afternoon while its bearer rested in the infirmary hall. Headache, a complaint as universal in the medieval world as in our own, received a range of responses depending on its apparent cause and severity. A mild, tension-borne headache, the kind brought on by long hours of close reading or copying in poor light, often responded well to a simple infusion of chamomile or lavender, taken warm, alongside genuine rest in a quiet, darkened corner of the infirmary hall. More severe or persistent headache sometimes called for a cooling compress, linen soaked in rosewater, or a vinegar and water mixture laid across the brow, a remedy that, whatever its precise medical mechanism, offered the same basic, genuine comfort a cool cloth on a hot forehead still offers anyone today. Insomnia and general restlessness of mind, particularly common, it seems, among the older brothers whose bodies had grown weaker, even as their nights grew longer and harder to fill with sleep, found their answer in the valerian, chamomile, and lavender preparations we have already spent time with tonight, sometimes combined into a single evening cordial, sweetened with a little honey, given not long before the community's own final office of the day, so that the herb's gentle effect could settle over a restless brother, just as the monastery itself was settling into its own quiet nighttime hours. It is worth noting, in passing, how neatly this particular thread of medieval infirmary practice connects to the very content we are sharing together tonight. The same handful of gentle sleep herbs, understood and used with real care nearly 1,000 years ago, still recognized today for very much the same quiet, calming purpose. Fever, called by the general name ague, across a great deal of the surviving medical writing of the period, was among the most feared and most commonly treated of all the infirmary's ordinary complaints. arriving in waves through the warmer months in particular, and taking a heavy toll on the very old and the very young whenever it appeared. Willow bark decoction, already mentioned in connection with pain, served here too, its gentle fever-reducing properties recognized through long, patient observation centuries before the specific compound responsible for that effect would ever be identified and isolated in a laboratory. Feverfew, its very name announcing its most common use, was brewed into a similar decoction, and cooling compresses of vinegar and water, laid across the chest and brow, accompanied the herbal treatment. The whole approach aimed gently at helping the body cool and settle rather than at any dramatic or sudden intervention. Low spirits and a heaviness of mind, described in the medical language of the period, under the broad heading of melancholy, received their own particular and genuinely thoughtful attention, treated as a real bodily ailment rather than dismissed as simple weakness of character. Borage, its bright blue flowers, long associated in the old herbals with courage and gladness of heart, was infused into a gentle cordial for exactly this purpose, alongside St. John's wort, gathered at the height of summer and prized for lifting a burdened spirit. But herbs, in these cases, were rarely offered alone. The surviving accounts make clear that companionship, a quiet hour spent sitting with the afflicted brother, a return to the gentle daily rhythm of the garden, or the scriptorium as strength allowed, and the simple, steady presence of the wider community, were understood as being every bit as important to this particular kind of suffering as any cordial from the still room, a recognition of the whole person, body and spirit together, that runs through this entire tradition of care. Joint pain and the general stiffness of advancing age, already mentioned in connection with the warming room, found additional relief through warming liniments, oils infused slowly with rosemary or juniper, and worked gently into aching hands, knees, and hips. The physical act of the massage itself, performed patiently by whichever brother assisted the infirmarer that day, likely offering nearly as much genuine comfort as whatever herbal properties the oil itself carried. Coughs and hoarseness, distinct from the deeper chest complaints of full winter, but persistent and wearing all the same, found their own small procession of remedies through the infirmarer's cupboard. A simple syrup of honey and thyme, easily made and pleasant enough that even a reluctant patient rarely resisted it, eased the throat through an ordinary seasonal cough, while marshmallow root, its very name descended from the soothing, mucilaginous quality the plant was valued for, was prepared as a gentle, coating infusion for a throat rubbed raw by persistent coughing. Hoarseness in the older brothers, whose voices had naturally grown thinner and more fragile with age, was met with the same quiet acceptance given to every other small diminishment of advancing years, eased where it could be with a warm honeyed drink before the day's chanting, and simply allowed for, without complaint, where it could not. Wounds from the ordinary accidents of a working community, a slip with a garden tool, a kick from one of the monastery's draft animals, a fall on wet stone, were cleaned carefully, usually with wine, valued for its mild antiseptic properties long before anyone understood precisely why it worked, and then dressed with the same comfrey or yarrow preparations already discussed. The wound checked and redressed daily until it had closed and healed. More serious injuries, a broken bone from a bad fall, called for the setting and splinting skills that formed a further, distinct part of the infirmarer's training, the limb held carefully in place with wooden splints and linen wrapping until the bone had knit, the whole slow process monitored, again, with the same patient daily attention given to every other kind of complaint that passed through the infirmary door. Bruising and the ordinary soreness of a hard day's labor, distinct from any real wound, found a gentle answer in a simple warm compress, sometimes plain water, sometimes infused lightly with a little vinegar or wine, laid over the sore area and left to draw out the discomfort through the quiet accumulation of warmth alone. And a general weariness, the kind that settled into an older brother's limbs after a long stretch of ordinary daily labor and prayer, without any single named complaint attached to it at all, was met simply with rest, a little extra food, and where the season allowed, an afternoon spent sitting quietly in the sun of the Cloister garden rather than at any particular task. The infirmarer's plain, practical wisdom recognizing that not every kind of tiredness needed a remedy from the cupboard at all, and that sometimes the most useful thing he could offer a weary brother was simply permission to rest. Sleeplessness in the very young, where the monastery's wider charitable care extended to children of the surrounding countryside, or to the boy oblates raised within its own walls, was treated with exactly the same gentleness given to a restless old brother, a warm milk sweetened with a little honey and a pinch of dried chamomile, offered not long before the hour of rest, the same quiet, patient theory of gentle herbs and settled routine applied across every age the infirmarer's care might reach, from the youngest child brought to the gate by an anxious mother to the oldest brother, whose own nights had grown thin and difficult after 80 long years of living. And through it all, running beneath every single one of these ordinary, specific remedies, sat the same broader framework we have already spent some time with tonight, the careful balance of hot and cold, wet and dry, the seasonal rhythm of the Physic garden's harvest, the steady procession of the medical calendar, and, above everything else, the plain, patient willingness of one trained and trusted brother to sit with each new complaint as it arrived, to observe it closely, to draw on the accumulated knowledge of the herbal on his shelf, and the accumulated experience of his own years in the role, and to offer, as best his age's understanding allowed, whatever quiet measure of relief and comfort lay within his considerable, hard-won skill. There is one more room left for us to visit tonight before we let this long, gentle walk finally come to its close, and it is, in its own quiet way, the room that made everything else we have spoken of this evening possible at all. Let us turn now to the scriptorium, and to the herbals and leechbooks kept, copied, and passed down within it, because without this slow, patient work of writing and rewriting, the accumulated knowledge of the Physic garden, the still room, and the infirmary hall would have simply been lost, brother by brother, generation by generation, the way so much oral knowledge from this same period genuinely was lost, leaving barely a trace behind. The scriptorium itself, a quiet room set apart for the careful copying of manuscripts, sat at the very heart of what made a monastery, in the fullest sense, a place of learning as well as a place of prayer and healing. Here, seated at simple wooden desks, often in the same cold that made the cal factory's warmth so gratefully received, monks trained specifically in the careful, disciplined art of copying spent long hours reproducing texts word for word, letter for letter, from older manuscripts that were themselves, in many cases, already copies of copies, stretching back through earlier centuries. The physical labor involved was considerable and genuinely exhausting on the body, hunched over a desk for hours at a stretch, the hand cramping around a quill dipped repeatedly in ink that, as we have already heard, thickened and grew difficult to work with in the winter cold. And yet this labor, tedious as it must often have felt in the moment, preserved an extraordinary body of medical knowledge that would otherwise have simply vanished with the passing of each generation that held it. Among the texts a well-stocked monastic library might keep, several stand out clearly in the surviving record for their direct relevance to the infirmarer's daily work. The herbal attributed to Pseudo-Apuleius, circulating in various forms across early medieval Europe, offered descriptions and simple line, illustrations of a wide range of medicinal plants, giving even a monk, who had never traveled beyond his own region, some working knowledge of herbs, described originally by classical authors, writing in a very different climate and landscape. Walafrid Strabo's Hortulus, composed around the year 840 by a monk of the great abbey of Reichenau on its island in Lake Constance, offered something rather more personal, a genuine poem, written in Latin verse, describing the poet's own small monastery garden, plant by plant, sage and rue and fennel, and the rest, each one given its own brief, affectionate description drawn from the author's direct, hands-on experience of tending them. It survives as one of the warmest and most human documents to come down to us from this whole period. A monk's genuine love for his own small patch of cultivated earth, preserved now for well over 1,000 years. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess whose remarkable range of writing touched theology, music and natural science all at once, produced two texts of particular relevance to our walk tonight, the Physica and the Causa et Cura, both drawing on her own careful observation of the natural world around her convent alongside the inherited classical and early medieval medical tradition she had absorbed through her own extensive reading. Her descriptions of specific plants, their qualities, and their uses carry a distinctive personal voice that sets her writing apart from the more purely functional, list-like character of many earlier herbals, and several of her specific remedies for headache, for digestive trouble, for the general strengthening of a weakened constitution, appear to have circulated and been used well beyond her own community in the centuries following her death. The Circa Instans, compiled in the 12th century and closely associated with the great medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, represents a rather different kind of text, more systematic and more clearly organized as a practical working reference than Walafrid's personal poem or Hildegard's more idiosyncratic observations. Arranged alphabetically by the name of each herb or medicinal substance, it gave a working infirmarer a genuinely usable reference tool, something closer to what we might now recognize as a proper pharmacological handbook, listing the qualities, uses, and appropriate preparation of a very wide range of substances in a clear, consistent format that made it easy to locate the specific information needed for a specific complaint without wading through an entire text in search of a single relevant passage. The same school at Salerno, and the wider medical culture that grew up around it, also produced the collection of texts, now generally known as the Trotula, addressing, among other things, the specific medical concerns of women, pregnancy, childbirth, and related complaints, a body of knowledge that would have been of real, practical relevance whenever a monastery's charitable care extended, as it so often did through the almoner's work already described, to the wives and daughters of the surrounding countryside, even though the great majority of medieval infirmarers were themselves, of course, men working within all male communities. Behind all of these medieval compilations stood the far older figure of Dioscorides, the 1st century Greek physician whose original Herbal, written in Greek and covering several hundred plants and their medicinal uses, formed the ultimate foundation that so much later medieval herbal writing built upon, whether directly or through the layers of later commentary, translation, and adaptation that had grown up around it across nearly 1,000 intervening years. This text's long journey into the hands of a medieval monastic infirmarer is itself a genuinely remarkable story of transmission, passing from the Greek-speaking world of late antiquity into Byzantine and Arabic scholarly traditions, where it was studied, copied, and in some cases expanded upon by physicians working in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, before finally being translated into Latin and carried into Western European monastic libraries, in part through the specific efforts of Constantinus Africanus, a scholar who traveled from North Africa to the great monastery of Monte Cassino in the 11th century, bringing with him a body of Arabic medical texts that he set about translating into Latin for the benefit of Western readers who had, by this point, lost direct access to much of the older Greek medical tradition their own ancestors had once possessed. It is worth pausing on this long chain of transmission for a moment, because it reshapes, in a quiet but genuinely important way, how we ought to picture the infirmary at work in his still room, grinding herbs by candlelight in some small, remote monastery far from any of the great centers of learning we have just named. He was not working from some purely local, isolated body of folk tradition, cut off from the wider currents of medical knowledge moving through the medieval world. He was, whether he fully appreciated it himself or not, the final link in an extraordinarily long and international chain of careful observation and careful translation, stretching back through Arab scholars in Cordoba and Baghdad, through Byzantine copyists preserving Greek texts across the centuries of the classical world's slow transformation, all the way back to a 1st century Greek physician traveling. It is thought, with the Roman army recording the medicinal plants he encountered along the way, the quiet grinding of the mortar in a small monastic still room somewhere in the cold north of Europe was, in this light, the living end point of one of the longest and most patient chains of shared human knowledge that the medieval world produced. Beyond the herbals themselves, a well-provisioned monastic library often kept a further layer of related texts that supported the infirmarer's daily work in quieter, less obvious ways. Practical calendars, setting out the correct astronomical and liturgical dates for bloodletting throughout the year, circulated alongside the herbals proper, often copied into the same volume for convenience. Simple arithmetic texts helped a novice learn to work confidently with the drachms, scruples, and grains of the apothecary's weighing system already described. And commonplace books, personal collections of remedies, observations, and useful passages copied out by an individual infirmarer over the course of his own working life, sometimes survive as well, giving us a rarer and more intimate glimpse of one particular man's accumulated practical wisdom, set down for his own reference and, whether he intended it or not, for whichever brother would eventually inherit both his office and his careful, well-thumbed little book. The scriptorium's work did not stop at simple copying either. Many manuscripts, particularly the herbals, were illustrated, sometimes with real botanical care and accuracy, sometimes, especially in copies made by scribes working many generations, removed from any direct knowledge of the actual plant being described, with illustrations that had drifted, copy by copy, further and further from botanical reality, each new copyist working primarily from the previous copy, rather than from the living plant itself, so that a plant's illustrated form could, across several centuries of successive copying, become almost unrecognizable compared to how it actually grew in the Physic garden, just outside the scriptorium's own window. This is, in its own way, a gently humbling reminder of how knowledge changes and sometimes quietly degrades as it passes from hand to hand across long stretches of time, even within an institution as careful and as deliberately devoted to accurate preservation as a medieval monastery generally was. A handful of these manuscripts survive today, not in some distant national archive sealed away from ordinary eyes, but in careful modern facsimile editions that let anyone with a genuine interest turn the same pages in reproduction that a medieval infirmarer once turned by candlelight. Walafrid's Hortulus, Hildegard's Physica, the great herbal traditions of Solano, all of them have found their way, across the long centuries since they were first set down, into the hands of modern scholars who have translated, annotated, and preserved them with exactly the same patient, careful devotion the original scribes once brought to their own work. There is something quietly moving in this continuity, a chain of careful hands stretching from a 9th century monk on his island in Lake Constance, through a long, largely unbroken succession of copyists and translators, all the way to a modern editor, working at a desk not so different, in its basic shape, from the one in the scriptorium we have just visited together. It is worth remembering, too, that not every reader of these herbals was necessarily fluent in the Latin they were written in, and a number of surviving manuscripts show signs of translation, in whole or in part, into the vernacular languages spoken across the various regions of medieval Europe, English, French, German, and others, as this specialized medical knowledge gradually spread beyond the specifically Latin literate world of the cloister and the cathedral school. This slow process of translation, itself a further and quite considerable labor undertaken by monks and, in later centuries, by university-trained physicians working outside the monastery altogether, extended the reach of the same accumulated wisdom still further, carrying it toward exactly the kind of wider circulation among literate laypeople that would eventually, centuries after the period we have been discussing tonight, help lay some of the groundwork for medicine as a formally organized, university-trained profession distinct from its earlier monastic home. Preservation of these manuscripts, once copied, brought its own quiet, ongoing labor, distinct from the work of copying itself. Books were costly, made from carefully prepared animal skin that represented weeks of separate labor before a single word was ever written on it, and a monastery's library kept them accordingly, wrapped or boxed against damp, occasionally rebound as their bindings wore with use, and consulted with the same careful, respectful handling a costly and irreplaceable tool deserves. Some houses maintained a librarian, sometimes the same brother who oversaw the scriptorium itself, whose task included exactly this slow, careful stewardship, checking periodically for damage from damp or insects, arranging for a worn volume to be recopied before it became illegible, and generally standing guard over the accumulated written knowledge of the whole community, the way the Infirmarer himself stood guard over the community's accumulated medical knowledge, each of them a patient custodian of something built slowly, over generations, and easily lost through even a small lapse of ordinary care. And yet, for all these small and inevitable distortions, the overall achievement of this long tradition of monastic copying remains genuinely remarkable. A very great deal of what we now know about medieval medicine, and a fair amount of what we know about the classical medicine that came before it, survives today only because a long, largely anonymous succession of monks, working in scriptoria very much like the one we have just visited, judged this particular body of knowledge worth the very considerable time and labor required to copy it out again and again and again across centuries in which fire, flood, war, and simple decay destroyed an enormous proportion of everything else that was ever written down. The herbal that sat on the lectern in a medieval infirmary's still room, consulted by candlelight before the preparation of some particular remedy, was not simply a convenient reference tool. It was the living end of an unbroken chain of careful, patient human attention, stretching back nearly 1,000 years and more, and it is, in a very real sense, this same chain of patient attention, copied and passed forward once again in a different form, that has carried the story we have been telling together all the way to you, tonight, wherever and whenever you happen to be listening. We have walked a very long way together tonight, and if you are still here with me, even faintly, even at the very edge of sleep, thank you for staying this whole quiet distance. Let us gather it all up now, slowly, the way the Infirmarer himself might have gathered his thoughts at the very end of a long working day, and let the whole shape of what we have seen settle gently over you as we go. We began at the low door in the cloister wall, stepping out into the Physic garden in the cool hush of early morning, the dew still silver on the sage and the lavender, the beds laid out in their long, careful rows the way they had been drawn centuries before either of us was born, on a fragile plan kept safe in a monastery library. We met the Infirmarer himself, a quiet, patient man whose name so rarely survives in any grand chronicle, chosen not for ambition but for steadiness, for a memory that could hold a whole garden's worth of remedies, for hands that could grind a powder or draw a vein with the same unhurried, careful attention. We followed him into the long infirmary hall, with its softer beds and its single small hearth, its rushes strewn with lavender, its altar close enough that even the weakest brother could hear the bells of the hours drifting gently through the open door. We climbed, in our imagination, into the drying loft, where lavender and sage and thyme hung upside down in long fragrant rows, and we sat for a while beside the still room's quiet fire, watching an infusion steep and a decoction simmer, learning the slow, patient difference between a tincture and a syrup, an ointment and an electuary. We stood before the apothecary's locked cupboard, its small jars labelled in a careful hand, its weights and scales measuring out drachms and scruples with a precision that might surprise anyone who imagines this whole world as a place of guesswork rather than genuine, hard-won craft. We listened to the low, steady grinding of the mortar, and we sat with the Infirmarer through the quiet, calendar-bound ritual of bloodletting, a practice that asks for our understanding rather than our judgment, carried out here with a gentleness that set it apart from its harsher reputation. We followed the whole turning wheel of the medical year, winter's coughs and chilblains giving way to spring's bitter, restorative greens, summer's long harvest giving way to autumn's quiet gathering in, the astrological zodiac man, and the ancient wisdom of Dioscorides threading invisibly through it all, connecting one small, remote infirmary to physicians working centuries earlier in Baghdad and Cordoba and Toledo. We warmed our hands, for a little while, at the single fire of the Cal factory, the one room where the whole community, and especially its oldest and most tired members, was permitted a small, deliberate comfort against the hardest months of the year. We sat at the misericord table, softened bread and warmed wine and gentle broth, offered not as weakness, but as mercy freely given to those whose long service had earned them, at last, a gentler pace. And we sat, too, with real tenderness, beside a brother in his final hours, surrounded by familiar voices and familiar prayers, never left alone, cared for right to the very end with the same patient, unhurried attention that had shaped every other part of his long life within these walls. We stepped outside the gate for a while, into the wider world of pilgrims and travellers, and the sick poor of the surrounding countryside, and we saw how freely this whole quiet system of care extended itself outward, never keeping its gentleness only for itself. And finally we climbed into the scriptorium, where a long, patient chain of anonymous hands copied and recopied the herbals and leechbooks that carried all of this knowledge forward, across centuries of fire and flood and war, all the way to tonight, all the way to you, wherever you happen to be resting right now. It is a great deal to have walked through together, and if some of it has already slipped quietly out of your mind, drifted off somewhere between the Physic garden and the warming room, that is exactly as it should be. None of this was ever meant to be remembered in careful detail. It was only ever meant to be a place to rest inside for a while, a slow, gentle, candlelit world entirely without urgency, without argument, without anything at all that needs solving before you can finally let go. If your eyes have grown heavy by now, and I rather hope they have, that is exactly the point of everything we have shared together tonight. Let them close. There is nothing left to attend to, nothing left to follow, nothing left waiting on the other side of sleep that cannot simply wait a little longer. Let your breathing settle into whatever slow, easy rhythm it wants to find. Let your shoulders sink a little further into whatever is holding you right now. The garden is tended, the still room's fire has been banked for the night. The last of the day's remedies have already been carried to whichever bed needed them, and the infirmary hall has gone quiet, the way it always did at this hour, candles guttering low, the whole long day's patient work finally gently done. Somewhere, in the soft dark behind your closing eyes, imagine that same low door in the cloister wall, and beyond it, the Physic garden settling into its own nighttime stillness, rows of sage and lavender and mint standing quiet under whatever moon happens to be rising tonight, patient, unhurried, entirely at peace, exactly the way this whole evening has tried, in its own small way, to help you feel. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back again soon, with another slow, candlelit corner of the old world to wander through together. For now, there is nothing left to do at all, except rest.